Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we've got a special episode for all y'all because we are re-airing an old recording from back in our Weekly Stuff days because it is relevant to what we're doing here with Japanimation Station.
Yeah, so this is the first episode of Season 2.5, I guess we can call it, airing in the middle of Season 2. Don't worry, Season 2 is not being interrupted. These are purely bonus episodes. But Season 2 is all about ufotable, and ufotable makes the most famous anime in the world right now, Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer, and that just so happens in 3 weeks on April 9th, returning for its third season. So, to make sure these are up on the Japanimation Station page for those who haven't listened to them, or maybe want to listen to them again as they're maybe doing some re-watching ahead of Season 3, we're going to be re-airing these. And the first episode you're hearing today, part 1 of, I guess, Sean, we can call this Ufotable no Yaiba. How does that sound?
Yes.
All right.
That sounds very good.
Blade of Ufotable. That actually sounds pretty good. That should be like a documentary about everyone working at Ufotable. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, today's episode is us talking about Season 1 of Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer, now known as the Unwavering Resolve Arc, the first 26 episodes of Tanjiro's
Is that what it's actually called?
Yes.
I've not heard that.
They have, it was not at the time of airing, but they have since on like the soundtrack album they put out and some other materials, because every other season of the show now is like the something arc, they've gone back and called Season 1, even though Season 1 is like 5 arcs, the Tanjiro Kamado Unwavering Resolve Arc. And I do kind of like that title.
It's the classic shonen problem of where you open up your show with a bunch of smaller arcs while the series is finding itself, and then it gets known for bigger story arcs later on. You're like, well, what do we call that weird hodgepodge of like 5 to 6 different story arcs we all did in one season? Unwavering Resolve. That works well enough.
Yeah, so you will not hear us call it the Unwavering Resolve Arc in today's episode, because when we recorded this, the movie was not yet out, Season 2 was not yet out, they had not retroactively given it this name, but we will talk about the first 26 episodes, and it is definitely a good supplement to what we're talking about on Season 2 of Japanimation Station. Right now we're in the Fate Zero stuff, and obviously all of that, led up eventually to Kimetsu no Yaiba. So Next week you will hear us talk about the movie Mugen Train when that came out, and then finally Season 2 in the third week as we lead up to the Swordsmith Village arc, which, since people have been asking when that season is done, there will be a 4th episode, and we will talk all about the Swordsmith Village arc, which we're both very excited for.
Yes, 100%. So if you haven't watched any Kimetsu no Yaiba, get on that and then enjoy listening to this old but still good podcast. Let's talk about slaying some demons. Let's talk about Yaibas and how they might Metsu the key. Let's talk about Kimetsu no Yaiba.
Let's start with the title. There was some consternation a couple weeks ago on the show when I actually didn't do anything. All I did was I made a list of games that were coming out, and there was a game called Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba, and I cut and pasted into a list, and then I alphabetized that list automatically in Word, and then you got mad at me for how the list was alphabetized, because it should be under K for Kimetsu no Yaiba. Explain why the English title Demon Slayer is so unbelievably lame.
Yeah, so it's just something of where it feels like the title stuff comes from this urge to make it accessible, quote unquote, to a Western audience, even though, Japanese shit is accessible, right? So people will like look at Kimetsu no Yaiba and they're like, oh, it's the cool thing that like everybody's into. It's the same way that like they didn't bring over Yojimbo and title that movie Bodyguard, right? Like it's a movie, or it's a series that's set in Taisho era Japan, meaning it's a lot of people walking around with fucking katanas and shit. Although really they shouldn't be. They should just all be arrested as soon as they set foot. I don't know how Tanjiro got through most of Tokyo in the arc where he meets Muzan without getting arrested immediately. But it's it's a very, very Japanese setting. It's a very, very Japanese property. It's not something like Cowboy Bebop or something that is feels like its setting is more kind of like global. Because it's in space and shit. This is such a Japanese property to me that it feels weird to sort of shuffle away from the Japanese title. Also because the Japanese title is sick as hell. It sounds so cool. Like, even if you don't know anything about Japanese, Kimetsu no Yaiba just sounds super cool. And it's also, I think it's just a cool title in Japanese. It means, so if you were to translate the title literally, you translate to something like Sword of Demon Destruction, the Blade of Destroying Demons, Sword of Demons Bane, whatever, like, fancy way you want to take away the concept of a sword that destroys demons. One thing that's cool about the title is the word Kimetsu is not a like traditional Japanese word. It's a sort of manufactured kanji compound taking ki or oni, which is the kanji for demon, and then metsu, which is the kanji for destroy, and putting them together to make the word Kimetsu. It's why the title always has furigana, or like a way of, it shows what the pronunciation is because it's not like a real Japanese word. Then Yaiba just is a word for sword. So yeah, it's just a very cool title. And while we're talking about the title, I do want to address what is actually the thing that is offensive to me, which is the title of the movie in English is so stupid. The title of the movie, which we'll talk about next week, is Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba the movie, Mugen Train. One, don't have 2 colons in your title. I just hate it. It's just disgusting. It makes my skin crawl when I see it. And 2, why the fuck would you not translate the word Mugen there? Like, if you're taking the localization approach of let's make the fake English title Demon Slayer to not alienate audiences, why would you not translate the word Mugen, which just means infinite? There's nothing wrong with subtitling your movie in English, The Infinite Train or Infinity Train or however you want to like take that. There's a couple ways
Infinity Train sounds great. We just had a movie called Infinity War last year.
Exactly. Infinite or infinity are 2 very cool words that you could have as subtitles, and it just boggles the mind that even if you didn't have Demon Slayer and you just called it in the States Kimetsu no Yaiba the movie, I would still translate the word Mugen in that instance. I would never leave the word Mugen untranslated, and it blows my mind that how they approach the titling. But all that doesn't matter. None of that shit is actually important.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing. Like, the funny thing to me is, you explain that side of it. It's also just like, as a choice of English title, Demon Slayer is like the most just like straightforward description you could give. It's like if instead of calling like Boku no Hero Academia, which they just did My Hero Academia, nice like catchy title, if they had called that Hero School, right? Like, that would suck. You could have called this show Demon's Bane or Sword of Demon's Bane. That would be really fucking, it kind of sounds like a D&D campaign, but, it would be cool. But they just went with, like, the most milquetoast title. Clearly hasn't hurt the series, but it is our little pet peeve with it, because Kimetsu no Yaiba is cool. It rolls off the tongue. They say Yaiba, like, 7 times an episode. It's cool.
Yeah, it is also, I think it is actually thematically important that the series is named after the swords, and it's, like, broadly speaking, it's named after the swords and not after the Demon Slayers themselves. But we'll talk about that when we talk about the show. But yes, Kimetsu Yaiba, we're finally talking about it. It is the most hip thing in the island nation of Japan, and is, I think, on its way to being super hip over here as well. I know Several of my students also are a big fan of these shows because their Google School, like Google Classroom accounts have pictures of like Nezuko and Tanjiro and shit. I'm like, hey, I know who all these people are.
I can tell it's big. My class, which I have about 60 students across my 3 classes, and every time I bring it up, someone in one of those classes knows it. So, like, at least all of my classes, there are people in there who watch this and are excited about it. So, yeah, and that does not happen for all anime. I do not have, like, a Gundam fan in every class I teach, but there's a Kimetsu fan in all of them.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear you, Sean, put in context for us the success of Kimetsu. Like, the moment I knew this thing was huge was at Jump Fest last year. Eiichiro Oda wrote Gotouge, the author of Kimetsu no Yaiba, a very nice little conciliatory letter handing off the baton of you are now the highest selling manga, because for 11 years, up through 2018, One Piece was the highest selling manga in Japan every year, over a decade. So that was the status quo forever, was One Piece sold more manga than anyone else year in and year out for over a decade. And then the year the anime came out, Demon Slayer got really fucking big and outsold One Piece for the first time. And so Eiichiro Oda had to write this little nice note saying, congratulations, you are now the king. Obviously, it has not sold more than One Piece in total, but in that year, and like this year it's going to do it too, it has sold over 150 million copies, and it is a short manga. It's 23 volumes. It is in the top 10 of all time of manga sales, and it is the series with the fewest volumes in that top 10.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, like, because let's just kind of go over the little bit, like, the history of what this thing is, where it comes from, yeah, with its success and everything, kind of like the way we do Weekly Suit Gundam, because I think it's quite interesting. I think Kimetsu no Yaiba represents a broader shift in the industry, that has like happened on a lot of different levels that kind of leads it to its success. But yeah, but just talking about its success, as you said, Jonathan, kind of I think like the most recent numbers we have are it's over 150 million copies, including digital copies, which digital is a really significant part of Kimetsu no Yaiba's whole like success, both in terms of anime and the manga. The thing that I like, I'm going to just read off from here some of the sales section of the Wikipedia page, because this is the thing that I think is just really kind of eye-opening about the nature of its success. Kimetsu no Yaiba was the first series to take all top 10 positions of Oricon's weekly manga chart, Oricon being a manga like seller and then like tracker in Japan in terms of sales and stuff. The manga occupied the entire top 10 for a full month, and it was also the first series in Oricon's history to occupy the entire top 19 weekly rank. In October 2020, the 22 volumes at the time of the series occupied the top 22 spots of Oricon's weekly manga chart. It was the best-selling manga for the first half of 2020 with 45 million copies sold, and its 20 volumes, including the special edition of Volume 20 at the time, were among the top 25 best-selling manga volumes of 2020. Demon Slayer Kimetsu no Yaiba's first 22 volumes were the best-selling manga volumes of 2020, making the series as well as the best-selling manga series in 2020 as a whole, with 82 million copies sold in that year. So that's part of what is crazy about the success of Kimetsu no Yaiba, is that it's not like One Piece, which just steadily sells well and has steadily very, very well and has forever, right? Because it's been a long, long ongoing series. Kimetsu no Yaiba, instead of being this long ongoing like monster like a One Piece or a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or Naruto or Dragon Ball, you know, some of those have kind of ended. Naruto kind of hasn't ended because it just sort of, Boruto's a different mangaka, but it's still that same series and it does quite well. But those just have this like long standing, really powerful success that just sustains for huge stretches of time. Kimetsu no Yaiba's success is like you just dropped a fucking bomb and it exploded. Because most
of its success also came when it was done or nearing completion, which is really rare. Because when you, like exactly what you were saying, Sean, let's put some names to this. So it is the 9th series from Weekly Jump to have 100 million copies in circulation. Those other series are Kochikame, Fist of the North Star, Dragon Ball, JoJo, Slam Dunk, One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach. What do they all have in common? They're very fucking long, right? And they had a big, long arc of a moment. Or they have never ended in the sense of like One Piece, Naruto, Dragon Ball, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, this is like a totally different vision of what success for a series like this looks like. because, I mean, the manga started serialization February 2016, ended serialization May 2020, and then a little bit after that is when you would get the last volume published in the tankobon format that takes a bunch of the chapters and publishes them as a volume. And near the end there, in April 2019, is when the Kimetsu no Yaiba 26-episode anime season started airing, and that finished airing in September 2019. And so it's like right at the end of its lifetime is when it got its first anime adaptation in that first season. And what you saw was the strategy of anime in Japan in terms of sales has always been partially connected to a motivation to also profit off of increased sales from whatever the adaptation is. It's one of the reasons why adaptations are so much more common for manga and light novels, is because there are multiple revenue streams you can take advantage of with a multimedia property like that, right? But a lot of that has typically been motivated through Blu-ray sales and things like that of physical home media. It's one of the reasons why in the kind of the otaku market that comes out from the sort of fallout of Neon Genesis Evangelion and its industry-breaking success is really sort of finding ways to, through specialty and limited edition products, make a lot of money off of what is sometimes a relatively limited audience. And so Blu-rays can be super expensive, but they have incredibly nice packaging. I just saw on YouTube the other day recommended me a video that was a Japanese promotional video with the voice actors for Kimetsu no Yaiba for the Blu-ray release of the movie in Japan. And it's the nicest fucking packaging you have seen for anything ever. It's so gorgeous. And it's one movie, but it's got 3 discs in it and all this special shit.
I've been looking at it because I'm thinking of pre-ordering it because it's got the subtitles and everything. Yeah. And it is an art book and an art box, and it's actually not the most expensive of these. It's about $100, and they can go for a lot more than that, I will tell you.
But it's but it's $100 for a Blu-ray that is one movie.
Yeah.
So which is not what you usually would get in the States. And then that's just one part of it. Then you would have figures, and you have you have your whole wide range of different merchandising opportunities, and that's part of what sort of fuels the anime industry in the traditional post EVA era. And here I think we're beginning to see this is the impact of streaming on the market, is that after Kimetsu no Yaiba finished its anime run with what is an incredible adaptation, and we'll talk about that obviously is kind of our main topic. But after it finishes that anime run, that's where you see this massive explosion of interest of everyone is into the show. It hits the mainstream like a fucking train, and everyone's buying every single volume of the manga, because I have also, the other night, I caught up to basically where season 1 ends in the manga, and I can confirm it's a really good fucking manga. Even if you have watched the anime, and you just start from the beginning, and I watched the anime when it finished airing in 2019. I rewatched it a couple weeks ago over spring break for this podcast, and then I read the manga. And so it's if I were to be burnt out on that section of story, I would be burnt out on that section of story. And it's no, it's so entertaining that I don't know if I'll be able to just keep myself from moving on before the movie next week, because it's I really just kind of want to keep reading it, but I also don't want to read the movie part before the movie when I'm that close. But it's just such a compelling manga. And so that sort of synergy between streaming services allowing you to binge the series when it hits the public consciousness and the zeitgeist, and it's widely accessible to a huge number of people for very, very cheap, then motivates them to buy the manga. And the fact that digital manga is so much more popular now means that they have, again, way more avenues by which for the average person to get the manga, and those kind of barriers are lessened, so you don't have to go buy big volumes of it, or volumes of it that 23 volumes of a manga. That's a lot of shit to go out and buy from stores and keep in your house and stuff like that.
Let me put in another perspective too, because one thing is also just the digital manga space has taken longer to develop in Japan than it has over here for a variety of reasons. The space in America has almost completely shifted to digital. That's how Jump is done over here and everything. But one thing to know about series like One Piece and stuff is that if you're going to go buy back volumes of One Piece or any other manga in Japan, you have to go to an actual bookstore. And there are plenty of bookstores, but that's a different thing than if you are picking up the new volume of One Piece, that will always be at your local convenience store. And I can confirm that because when I was in Japan, I bought volume 95 from a convenience store. It was in every Lawson and every 7 I went into when I was in Japan. Is every single one you could buy the new volume of One Piece, right? But you couldn't buy in your Lawson volumes 1 through 94 because that would take up more space than they have for food, right?
Yes.
Let alone like keep them in your houses, which in Japan you generally have less space than we do in American housing, right? Let alone, so these are all issues. But Demon Slayer, it's digital and you can just go buy all 23 volumes at once digital, right? And that's, I think, part of it too, is that the back catalog is smaller, but you're also not going to be able to go pick up that whole back catalog from one place unless you go to a bookstore. And then there's a limit on how many books you can actually push out and give to people. So it's breaking sort of rules left and right in terms of how people are digesting this stuff and changing the game.
Yeah, and just creating this huge explosion of popularity that then currently has hit its zenith with the movie, which is currently the highest grossing movie in the history of Japanese box office, even when it's during the fucking pandemic. It's still like, who gives a shit? Like, the movie's good. People are going to go see it. And like, because I mean, it got success very quickly, and then it has had like an incredible tail on it as well.
Let me, can I do the stats on the movie?
Yeah, go ahead.
It blows me away. So it's grossed over 400 million worldwide. So let's see. It has grossed over US 414 million worldwide, making it the first Japanese film and first anime film to reach 400 million worldwide. It is the first R-rated animated film to set multiple box office records, including the highest grossing film of all time in Japan, the highest grossing anime film and Japanese film of all time, the highest grossing animated film of 2020, the 4th highest grossing film of 2020, the 7th highest grossing traditional animated film, the highest grossing horror film of 2020, the 16th highest grossing non-English film, the highest grossing R-rated animated film of all time, and the 34th highest grossing R-rated film worldwide, period. It's a lot. Spirited Away had held that record for a very long time. I think Your Name briefly overtook it, and then Spirited Away got it back. There was like some wrangling over like exchange rates and shit. But no, that is a long-standing record that Demon Slayer just fucking killed.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like also like it's an anime TV show movie. It's not like the ones that had held this record before were things like Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke and Your Name, movies that are original and not tied to a show. This is a movie from a show that grossed 400. I mean, it's unbelievable, unreal. It also was like in the wake of the pandemic, absolutely crazy.
Yeah, because also it's not even just a movie from the show. Like, it is the continuation of the story arc from the TV show / the manga, right? So it's not like most anime movies from TV series, which are generally standalone, vaguely like non-canonical, your One Piece movies, Dragon Ball movies, the Naruto movies. Some of them, they might, Naruto has like the last Naruto the movie, the best title for any movie ever. That is like a continuation of the story, but it's not very common. And here it's just like, because that's also a continuation of the story, quote unquote. That's also not an original story for the movie. That is not an adaptation of a manga, that it continues past where the manga ends. This is just where the TV show leaves off, is like basically a brief tease of what the movie's going to be about. It's the train, then Goku's on there, the demon from the end that the show that gets the blood from Muzan is on top of the train, and it's like the movie's coming out next year, and everyone's like, your mind's fucking blown. And especially because the fucking TV show is genius and ends with a training arc. So you are like so primed to want to see what happens next. And yeah, so, but like the idea that a movie that you need to have watched at very least 26 episodes of a TV show to like really kind of get the whole thing, because it is just a continuation of the story, or have read the manga up to that point, and it's not a standalone thing, to be able to break that record is fucking crazy.
Yeah, and most of that 400 million came from Japan itself. And like, it needs to be stressed, like, Japan doesn't have as many people as the United States. 400 million would be rare for a movie. It is rare for a movie in the United States to make that in the US. That's like every man, woman, and child in Japan went to see this movie. Like, not literally, but like that's basically what it would have to be, like, in terms of that and repeat viewings and stuff to make that kind of money. It's big.
Yeah, it is incredibly big. I mean, on the popularity section of Wikipedia, they have these stats from a poll that I love. According to a 2020 internet poll conducted by Oricon Monitor Research, over 90% of Japanese public is familiar with Kimetsu no Yaiba. 40.5% said that they were very familiar. 57% said that they were familiar with the name, indicating that 97.8% knew of the existence of the series. Of the 1,558 respondents who said that they were very familiar, 1,000 said like or very liked the series. So yeah, so it is very well known. It's very popular. I mean, if you consume any amount of like tertiary Japanese media, like I do, like the podcasts or radio shows or like YouTube streamers and stuff like that, it like you could tell when it happened because it's just like all of a sudden everybody's talking about it, everyone's making references to it. It is like hit a huge degree of popularity. So big, and I just have to add this, Sean, because it's too perfect not to, that some journalist went and found Hayao Miyazaki while he was cleaning the river, which Hayao Miyazaki famously, he goes to the river by his house every Saturday and he cleans the river. And someone went and found him and interviewed him about this. So even Hayao Miyazaki has talked about Demon Slayer. So here it is, on how he feels about Demon Slayer closing in on Spirited Away. I don't think that has anything to do with me. As long as the workplace they make is peaceful and they're doing their best, that's all that matters. On if he's watched Demon Slayer. I haven't seen it. I rarely watch. I watch other things. I don't watch TV or movies. I'm a retired old man who picks up trash. On how he feels about fans lamenting Spirited Away losing its spot. I don't care about that. The industry will be inflated these days. Anyway, I need to pick up trash. Anyway, rousing endorsement from Hayao Miyazaki. I love that. Yes, and if you're gonna do a Miyazaki quote, I'm gonna do the Tomino quote because Yoshiyuki Tomino, the creator of Gundam, was also asked about his impression on Kimetsu no Yaiba. He said it had such a dedicated and talented staff. The voice actors are great. The composer of the song that everyone knows is great. So many talented people showed up. In that sense, what I felt surpassed envy, and I started thinking, man, those guys sure are something. And then later in the interview, he has this other quote. I don't think that Demon Slayer is a calculated or contrived work. I think its assemblage was quite a coincidence. So basically saying that, like, it was a coincidence of all these really talented people coming together to work on this thing that made it such a huge success. Not like him dismissing it as a coincidence.
Tomino, much more engaged and conciliatory. That does make sense given his and Miyazaki's respective personalities.
Yes, yeah. He's like, man, they really made a good thing. It's like, I wish I could make a thing that's that good. Like, that's him saying that, not me saying, like, I think Tomino has made more than enough good stuff. But yeah, no, so everyone knows about it. Everybody loves it. But let's talk about a little bit of where it comes from and like why it has that success, because I think it's just such a fascinating combination of things, kind of like what Tomino says of like, it feels like all these different factors came together to create this thing that just exploded in popularity. One of those things is, I think, those shifting business realities of the market in Japan sort of created this cocktail by which something was going to blow it up, right? Something was going to come out that would exploit the ways that people consuming this media had changed and just create a flashpoint, just because there hadn't been something that was quite that huge. And it was, you're still being sustained by stuff like One Piece that has been around for a while, whereas Kimetsu no Yaiba like flashed so quickly. So one thing that's interesting about it is that it is currently the first and only serialized story published by the mangaka Kyoharu Gotouge. So Gotouge Sensei, born in 1989, so like a very young mangaka, a little bit older than us, had how manga typically works in Japan. You kind of get some if you manage to get published in an editor and stuff, you get one shots published in magazines that are basically one-off stories, more or less, that sometimes serve as backdoor pilots, more or less, that also kind of test ideas and things like that, which kind of is part of how Kimetsu came about. But had a couple of one-shots published between 2013 and 2015, mostly in Weekly Shonen Jump. But hadn't gotten anything picked up to be serialized yet. And then they, Gotouge Sensei, along with their publisher, sort of decided, okay, let's take some of the ideas from Gotouge Sensei's first published work, Kagari Gari, which has, I haven't read it, but from what I understand, it has something similar to Kimetsu no Yaiba with demons and swords and that kind of stuff. Let's take that, workshop it, try to make something. That's where they came up with Kimetsu no Yaiba's kind of prototype, which was a thing called Kisatsu no Nagare, which basically means the flow of demon killing. And then made a sort of one chapter thing based on that. And then the editor looked at that, said, let's take this idea, let's lighten it up a little bit, add a little bit more humor, because Kimetsu no Yaiba is like a light horror manga, basically. As you said, Jonathan, it's like, if you categorize it that way, it's like one of the highest grossing horror movies of all time, because it has all these horror elements to it. But let's lighten it up a little bit, make it a little bit more accessible for the Shonen Jump main demographic, which is adolescent boys, which is what the word shonen means. And then so workshop that into Kimetsu no Yaiba, and then release that again in February 2016, to begin serialization. And then it just serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump up until late 2020, where it's composed of 23 volumes, which is 205 chapters of manga, which is just such a tight run. Because it's not inconsequential. It's small relative to certainly a One Piece, but it's still a really meaty run of a manga. But during its run, it was reasonably popular, but it didn't explode. It wasn't a Bleach, a Naruto, a One Piece that those series attained a pretty high level of popularity pretty early in their run. This is just this really putting out a chapter every fucking week and just getting it done, and doing it aiming for what feels like. And it feels like experiencing the story, even in the anime or the manga form, what feels like something that was designed to have a targeted end that it's building to, and it did not have narrative elements built into it to expand it beyond the original scope of the premise. And it's just to me such an efficient production on the manga side.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of the issues of Jump that it was in because of when I was in Japan. I picked up a couple, and it is, at that point, it's pretty late in its run, and it's near the front of the magazine, because if you don't know, the way Jump is organized is the chapters for all the different series. There's about 18 series in Jump at any time, and they're organized by popularity. So One Piece is almost always the first thing in the magazine. And I think one of those issues, Kimetsu, is the first thing, because it's getting really big. But in one of them, it is not. It's 3 or 4. So you can kind of see that alone just in, it probably started near the back of the magazine, and then it came up near the front.
Yeah. And just having read I think is the first 6 volumes of the manga, which is what the anime covers. It's that plus just the very, very beginning. It's not even the first full chapter. It's half of the first chapter, volume 7, which is kind of the tease they have at the end of the anime season. Having read that 6 volumes of the manga, I could say my main impressions of it are, because Jonathan, did you read any of the manga, a sustained chunk of the manga?
So I skimmed through it as I was going to just kind of see what was compared, and there were some moments where I'm like the big moment in episode 19, I'm like, how is this in the manga that inspired them? And I read that, but no, I have not sat down and read it cover to cover.
Yeah, so my impressions of the manga, and I'll talk about a couple of specific adaptational choices they make, although the anime doesn't take a lot of notable liberties. It moves a couple things around and stuff.
It seemed pretty close.
Yeah, it's a pretty close adaptation. But the manga, I think one thing that's interesting is that it feels like it is someone's first big series that they worked on, in the sense of the art itself is kind of rough around the edges. Certainly, if you're used to, if you compare it to Toriyama in Dragon Ball or something like that. Toriyama's art style is very simple, relatively speaking, but it's very, very clean. And Kimetsu no Yaiba feels particularly in that first volume, it's a little bit rough. But I think Gotouge Sensei has such a clear vision of page layout and paneling. And that is the thing that makes the manga so compelling. And I think it highlights for me something that I've always kind of believed, but I haven't had a good example of here's a really good example of this, which is that comic books or manga are so much more live and die by that process of the sequential storytelling of how do you put the panels together, how do you convey the story through the contrast and juxtaposition of images. That's way more important than the more objective artistic quality of representation within individual panels of a comic book, because you can look at many other manga and the artistic quality of what is depicted in terms of the cleanness of the lines, the detail and things like that. If you look at Attack on Titan, you look at Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, Bleach, all of those I would say are much better at that, at least in the early sections of Kimetsu that I've read so far. And one I would put specifically in this camp is My Hero Academia, which I read the first couple of volumes of as a manga back when I think season 2 had finished airing of the anime, and I really liked that season and the first 2 seasons. And I was like, oh, let me see where this story goes rather than have to wait a year plus for the anime to continue. And I read a couple of volumes of My Hero Academia and kind of fell off of it because the art was technically very competent, but I don't think as a manga My Hero Academia works nearly as well as the anime does with the like action direction and the voice acting and the music that really elevates some of that material. I think the core storytelling of My Hero Academia is sort of average. I think the anime takes that and elevates it to like kind of a higher level of quality. Whereas Kimetsu no Yaiba, I wouldn't say the quality of like individual panels in terms of the artistic depiction is better at any point than like some of the stuff in My Hero Academia. But the way of constructing action, the way of depicting characters, the knowing when to just have a panel that is just Tanjiro's face and just looking at his facial expression and communicating story that way. Like there's an elegance to the storytelling of the manga that I think is really, really effective. And yeah, like I think people should read the manga if you're interested because I think it does.
Yeah.
It works really, really well in that original format.
It's interesting. So I have not read as much of it as you have, but I think I know what you're talking about. And this is something I think about a lot too. Like this is why to me Dragon Ball is such a masterpiece is it has Toriyama being a great artist. He is also a master paneler.
Yes.
Like his paneling is phenomenal in Dragon Ball. And I think people who haven't read it, like you really should and see where it comes from because that's part of why it is such a gripping and fun manga is he's just really good at that. And of course for Toriyama though, it's very different because by the time he started Dragon Ball, he was a veteran, practically. Yeah. He'd done all of Dr. Slump, which ran for 7 years or so, like, and was a hit. So like he'd put in all his licks, right? And, there's other manga that I know what you mean. Like One Piece is one that has like a fair amount of like controversy is maybe the wrong word, but like debate in the fandom of how good Oda is as a paneler because he has very, very busy panels. They've only gotten busier over time and sometimes it can be a little confusing to read. I think sometimes he is brilliant at it. I think sometimes this is going to sound so fucking stupid. I think One Piece should actually be longer than it actually is because he packs too much incident into individual like chapters and then the paneling gets kind of wild. But like, that can go up and down for some people. I know there are some people who are anime only on One Piece because they find the manga too busy. I don't think that personally, but I see why some people think that. I think Oda's a brilliant artist, but it's a very different kind of style. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is that kind of thing. And from what I saw on Kimetsu, I was actually surprised by how sort of rough around the edges the art was because the anime is like so refined. But right away you can tell, I think, what you're talking about there. And that is probably something that draws people into it, as many people have been.
Yeah, and I think particularly Volume 5, which is where all the stuff with Rui happens, like the spider demons, all that is basically what Volume 5 is. And that's where you can see, okay, here's like the bones of these, like what in the anime are these just like jaw-dropping action sequences. That like, the manga, because of what a manga is, right, those action sequences are much more focused and simple because or it would be like 20 pages of just like 2 exchanges in an action scene or whatever. You'd need so many images to depict what the anime is able to depict with just moving images and stuff. But like the bones of those action sequences are so strong, and there are a couple of pages that have like pretty complex action choreography. Of the one that really sort of I thought was really impressive is the whole exchange where Tanjiro and Inosuke are fighting the father demon who has like the big spider head, and Inosuke jumps off of Tanjiro's back. Tanjiro is on his head. He spins and cuts off the demon's leg. And then Inosuke comes up from behind after jumping up and cuts him in half, and they defeat him. Like, that's basically 2 pages of the manga, and the action is so crisp. It's like they are like masterclass pages on how do you do action scenes without fancy paneling. Like, it's very basic paneling. It's not like crazy, and then this bursts out of this panel and the other panel and stuff that like you'll get in more modern comic books or manga. It's like, I think it uses the basics really well. This is the point being, the manga is really great. People should check it out if you liked the anime. But let's also talk about the anime and where that comes about, because that's the other piece here, right? That's the other piece that makes the success of Kimetsu no Yaiba is you have the manga, you have this really great source material, but that source material has not managed to sort of break out into the mainstream. You're making an anime version of it. What do? Well,
I think the main success is, and like what really happened here is that they went to Ufotable, the animation studio, to make the show. Because Ufotable is, for my money, the best studio working in the anime business. I think it's like one of the best animation production companies in the world. And specifically in terms of digital animation, I think they're more or less unmatched in their ability to merge traditional 2D animation with 3D digital animating techniques. So Ufotable is a really, really fascinating studio. One place that they're fascinating is the name of the studio, Ufotable, literally is UFO table. So the people who made the studio, which was like a small group of animators who put the studio together in the early 2000s, led by an animator named Hikaru Kondo. He was very interested in this, like, I think it was like a European fancy looking table that was vaguely shaped like a UFO. And so when he and his buddies were like, hey, we should make our own anime studio, they're like, well, what should we name it? And then he was like, well, there's this really cool UFO table. And it's like, let's just name it Ufotable, because UFO is how you pronounce UFO basically in Japanese. And from my understand, they, like, that studio has since bought that table. And so they have a Ufotable at Ufotable. And for a very long time, I thought that the studio was pronounced Ufotable, because I thought Ufotable, that's a ridiculous name for an animation studio. And then when I looked up the reason for the name, it's like, nope, it is literally just called Ufotable, and that is fucking amazing. So they started in the early 2000s, and Ufotable's sort of main philosophy as a studio was to build a studio that did as much in-house as it possibly could. So for people who don't know how animation works, both in Japan and over here, this is true, is that the vast majority of actual animation work is outsourced by most studios. So like Nickelodeon did not do much of the animation for Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? Almost all that animation was handled by a couple of Korean studios. Same thing with like Batman the Animated Series. There were some animators that did some sequences in America. Most of that was outsourced to different production studios overseas. Japan usually doesn't outsource its stuff to foreign studios, but the anime industry in Japan is like a network of a lot of different studios, and then also a lot of freelancers that do the animation. So typically you would have whatever your studio, Sunrise, is making a show. They have a couple of core staff that they bring in-house, in like some like existing staff that they do some of the animation and stuff with. The bulk of in-between animation, like sort of like the like stuff that's not the kind of core, here's what we're defining our like visual elements of these scenes on, but like the extra frames you basically need to create all the movement you need. Those typically are outsourced to either another studio, or you just hire a bunch of freelancers that work in Japan that aren't employed by a specific studio, but just work job to job at different studios. And then also things like 3D animation and other digital like CG elements usually will then be outsourced to another studio that specializes in that material. And so that process of outsourcing to different companies and studios and freelancers is how the vast majority of animation is made.
Yeah. So, like, let me just give an example for people with, like, you'll have, if you look at, like, the credits of something like, I'm just going to use One Piece because it's easy and it's Toei, you will have your, director of that episode, your animation director, you'll have your character designer, and then you'll have, your key animators for the episodes. And there are, of course, people on Twitter who break all this down and say, that shot was done by this guy, that was done by this guy. And what they mean by key animation is you do the big movements, like the start of a swing and the end of a swing, and, like, the poses. And then the in-between animation goes elsewhere. And you will often see in Toei animation, like One Piece, when it gets to the... this will be written in English, so you can even tell if you don't read kanji. It'll say, like, Toei Philippines. Yeah. Because they have a whole, like, studio that does a lot of their in-betweening in the Philippines. And that is what you'll see in, like, almost every episode of One Piece, is some of it will get shipped off to the Philippines. That's, like, a little rare, because Toei is, like, a giant fucking factory. But yeah, that's sort of the process. And you'll see it, like, if you look at credits, you can tell who is, like, the person who works here at this company and is there every day working on the show, and then who are the freelancers who are finishing, Luffy's punch or something.
Exactly, yeah. So Ufotable's whole philosophy that they said, let's try to build up a studio where we can do as much of that stuff in-house with our own animation team and our own marketers and our own, like, digital people and background artists and composers. Like there's two composers, one of which we're revisiting from Gundam. But Go Shina is an in-house composer that works on a bunch of stuff for Ufotable Productions. And So that's kind of the germ of the idea that the studio starts with. They also start with mostly in-house productions in terms of a lot of their early work. Stuff that I haven't seen from the early 2000s is like original material that they made, and they actually had a like manga team that also made like manga based on their own shows for, I think, Coyote Ragtime Show. I know is one of their early things that people like that has that process where they made a manga in-house with ufotable people at the same time. Ufotable, also ufotable. I need to stop myself. I have to incorporate the actual pronunciation of this company now and not what I thought it was called for years.
Just picture the UFO table, Sean.
Exactly.
Just put a picture up on your computer right now and just look at it.
Yes. So ufotable also had something I loved from like the mid 2000s to the late, like early 2010s kind of. They had a claymation team that I don't think works there anymore because there's not an opportunity to do it much, but they would have claymation segments in some of their shows because ufotable used to be fucking weird. Ufotable's huge break, because they were like reasonably successful there, but they were working on smaller projects, and then they were also then doing outsourced work for other productions. One of the first things they did, Jonathan, is that they handled some of the 3D CG animation on Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny. So we have actually seen some ufotable work. Obviously, I didn't know that, and again, like it was like a relatively small part of that show, but that's like sort of how they made their money early on. And then in 2007, they started a partnership with Type Moon, which is a company that got very, very successful making a thing called Fate Stay Night, the visual novel headed by the writer Kinoko Nasu, who had also done a whole series of visual novels called Kara no Kyokai, or The Garden of Sinners is its official English title. And so Type Moon with Nasu partnered with ufotable to make an adaptation of that series of novels into a series of animated films that started in 2007. The last one came out, I want to say 2011 or 2013 or so. 2013.
I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, so 8 movies. There's a pretty big gap there between the like 7th and the 8th movie. And these are fantastic films. They're set vaguely in the same universe of the Fate Stay Night stuff, but you don't need to have seen any of that to understand it. It's its own characters and stuff. And they are great, great movies. And if you go and watch the first Kara no Kyokai movie, you will see immediately this is where ufotable became ufotable, because that's where they sort of innovated their approach to integrating 3D and digital animation with 2D animation techniques. So part of ufotable's whole let's do everything we can possibly in-house is not just let's have a great team of 2D animation people that just work here and work on our stuff. Let's also integrate our digital people and 3D people with our 2D people. So that's something where at ufotable's buildings, I think they have 2 offices, their 2D people and digital 3D people are not separated. They work on the same floor. They work like next to each other, which is uncommon. Most anime studios either don't have 3D CG people in-house, and that's something that is outsourced, or they like work on a different floor and they're separated because they're relatively different professions in many ways. ufotable integrates all that shit together. So there is like a very, very tight fusion between the digital teams and the CG teams and then the 2D animation teams. And you see that immediately in the Kara no Kyokai series. It kind of defines their approach to action with like very dynamic 3D cameras that take advantage of 3D backgrounds to be able to move the camera in 3D and then layer 2D animated elements on top of that so that you still get the look of 2D animation, but you're able to do things that you would not be able to do with a 2D camera unless you had like all the money in the world and like a million people to draw backgrounds to animate basically a 3D camera. And they would previs action sequences using 3D models and motion capturing, and then have 2D animators animate over that stuff. You get some of that in Kimetsu no Yaiba as well. And so they innovate with all that kind of production model over the course of the Kara no Kyokai movies. Then in 2010, they get contracted to do, or 2011, Fate Zero, which is that prequel to Fate Stay Night. And that show is fucking incredible. Then in 2014, they do Unlimited Blade Works, which is also incredible. So that's like where a lot of ufotable like really made their name, was with those Type Moon adaptations. And then in 2016, they made a show based on the Tales series of games called Tales of Zestiria the Cross. And that show is important because it's directed by someone they brought in named Haruo Sotozaki, who then sort of cut his teeth at ufotable on that show. And then he is the person who then went on in 2019 to direct Kimetsu no Yaiba, and then the movie, and is also going to be directing the next season, and so on and so forth. So you take ufotable, which is this studio that like doesn't make a lot of stuff relative to most other anime studios. It's relatively small, but because of that, it maintains this incredibly high level of quality for its productions. Has a very distinctive style and like capacity of the studio to do action in a way that almost no other studio can even try. And you're seeing a couple of studios, like the studio that makes Jujutsu Kaisen has done this a little bit. Cloverworks, which made an adaptation of a Fate spinoff, has like tried to replicate some of ufotable's production model, but nobody has done it as well as they have with merging 2D and digital animation together to achieve something that to me is like an utterly singular aesthetic that like I have never seen another studio be able to do. And Kimetsu no Yaiba is fascinating because if you look at this whole list of things, Kimetsu no Yaiba is the first adaptation of something that was not a video game or a visual novel that they had done since 2004. So that approach of you are not adapting a visual novel where you get to invent the visual style of Fate Stay Night because you just have a handful of static images in that novel. Like it's not a manga that you have like kind of storyboarded almost for you, or a video game that obviously you're making an anime based on a video game. Most of that you're creating your own scenes. Kimetsu no Yaiba, this is the first time that they take that approach and try to apply it to an adaptation of a manga, which has a much clearer visual aesthetic and style, pacing, and storytelling approach from the manga that you need to respect, but then also find a way to put your own stamp on. And I think they, let's just say they did a very good job of that. And that is why you then get this explosion of popularity, because the manga or the anime adaptation is so unbelievably fucking good. Everyone sees it. Everyone's like, this is so amazing. I want to see what happens next in the story. Reads the manga, goes and sees the movie, and everyone makes 500 billion yen.
Yep. So I think this is where we can finally talk about the anime, huh?
Yeah.
It's really good.
It's really fucking good, huh? Yeah.
It's really fucking good.
Like I said, I watched it for the first time back in 2019, but this is the first time you've watched through it, Jonathan. So what are your overall impressions of the show?
It's great. It's about a perfect season of anime. I mean, for these 26 episodes, so I am excited to come back around to all the stuff you're talking about with animation, because I have my own notes over here that I want to go through and talk about, and it's an incredible feat of animation in all sorts of ways. But it is also, and like more importantly, at like its foundation, it's a great story and it's great storytelling, and like the choice of what they decided to tell for these 26 episodes is perfect. And it is bold, and it is interesting, and it is like you just get to certain points, you're like, oh yeah, this is why this thing is a hit. And then you get to some points and you really understand it. But it is a just rock solid 26 episode season that like, I really have trouble imagining the kind of person who is even vaguely interested in anime who could watch this and not be moved to want to watch more, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, it just feels like this is one of those things that like a Cowboy Bebop or something. Like, I don't know, like one of those shows that just like, if you like anime, you're gonna like this thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And I think this is absolutely in that category. It's very accessible. It's a great first shonen series or a great 50th shonen series. It's just like, it's got those bones. I do not think as a story it like reinvents the wheel in a bunch of big ways, but I think it has, like, you'll recognize a lot of the beats. I have made the comparison on Twitter, and I will describe it here later more, that like in its bones, the skeleton of this thing is essentially Full Metal Alchemist, but like, I think there are little things it does, specifically in characterization and its approach between like the hero and the villains, that is what really makes this a special work. And it's something ufotable gets really well in their adaptation, and it's beautiful. And I think we haven't talked about this yet, but also the voice acting is out of this world good in this show. I think it is like, there are not just the three like main Demon Slayer boys. Yes. Of Tanjiro, Inosuke, and Zenitsu. All three of those characters are characters that I think would not work in an anime if you did not have the exact people playing them that they have playing them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, Sean?
Yes.
Like, these are difficult parts. Tanjiro talks throughout like half the show because of all his inner monologue. Zenitsu, you have that performance 1 degree off and he would be in-fucking-sufferable. Inosuke, if you have that performance 1 degree off, I think the character would just bounce off a wall. And I haven't heard the dub much, but I've heard Tanjiro in the dub, and he's just a generic boy, and I feel like that would be a very boring show to listen to. And it's just that side of it's amazing. The music side's amazing. It is just, wherever you sort of poke this thing, it is really well done. I have a couple of minor things I would say are criticisms, but it's amazing how few of those there are. It is a really rock solid show. Perfectly paced. This was something I was fascinated to see, is that it's not actually that fast paced in comparison to the manga. They only do 6 volumes for this first season. It's pretty much exactly 2 chapters an episode. You have anime that go much faster than that. You have some that go much slower than that. This is a very much like a Goldilocks. They found the right in the middle style, I think. It's great. It also has a theme song that I am convinced was designed by scientists in a lab to be the perfect anime theme song. I am convinced there are some Nobel Prize winning Japanese scientists who were kept in a lab for years on end, analyzing every anime theme song in history and figuring out note by note, second by second, what do you need to create the perfect anime theme song? And I think Grunge by Lisa is that song. And it is wild to me that every time I watch it, when the beat drops, I physically raise my hands in the air and then go down, because it's perfect. So there's a lot of different avenues by which this is a great show, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think it's as we always do on our anime-based podcast, we just defer to Tomino, because he's right? It is part of what it is. It's just it's this, all these groups of different talented people coming together, working on this show. Including obviously Gotogo Sensei making the manga and the foundation of everything, that creates this, because yes, it has some of the best voice acting of any show. It's some of the best casting. It is just perfectly cast. Especially reading the manga. I don't think there is any character that is more perfectly cast than Shinobu, the butterfly lady as Hayami Saudi. It is just you look at that character in the manga, it's there is no way you could have ever put anyone else in this role. And that's true of most of the characters. That is the one for me that's the zenith of nobody else could play this character. It is and that's true of so many characters. It's such a fine balance between it would be a little bit too dark or a little bit too silly. You wouldn't quite buy it. And it's so many of the characters exist right on that edge. Or with Zenitsu, like you said, it's a little bit too much and he would just be too annoying and the character wouldn't work. But if he's not annoying enough, the character doesn't work in the other direction, because the character's kind of supposed to be grating, which then makes, when he does something that's heroic, it's satisfying. It's the concept of the character. So it's all that stuff, it's such a tricky balance. I just think at every avenue the anime makes all the right choices. Where it decides to stick incredibly faithfully to the manga is perfect. Where it decides to make small adjustments or add a little thing here or move a line here or there, particularly it starts doing that more once you get to the Spider Clan area. All those little changes they make are perfect for how you'd adapt it to a manga or to an anime. At its core, like you said, Jonathan, it is not revolutionizing the shonen genre. But it is finding its niche that it occupies so effectively, making a couple of choices of, one, not being designed to be protracted, right? It doesn't give itself room to be an unending story. It has a very clear narrative arc that it feels like it's aiming for. And so it's not giving itself room to once we defeat the Junin Kizuki, now there's a second secret double evil group of demons, right? Which is something that these kinds of shows do all the time to keep on. I feel like Naruto does that 3 times, because it's oh shit, we're not quite ready to finish the Sasuke stuff. Fuck, we gotta come up with another one. That's the weakest part of Naruto, is that kind of ending section where it kind of can't figure out how to collapse everything together. Here it's this efficient version of one of these stories. Tanjiro starts out, after the first few episodes, he is very proficient at demon slaying, instead of having, here's the whole first season of the show where he kind of sucks, which is sort of what most of these shows do.
What was funny to me is I was totally thinking about that. Naruto I'm not super familiar with, but I've seen the early section of Naruto, and I feel this show goes through the throw all the kids in a forest and have them fight together in they're done with that by episode 4.
Yeah.
That's the first 50 episodes of Naruto, right?
Yeah.
I feel that whole arc where they're in the forest training in Naruto, that's 40 episodes in, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like that's something I love. They blow through this is something Full Metal Alchemist also does, which is part of my comparison of just like the throat clearing section of this. They just get rid of and then they move on, and it's great.
Yeah, and so exactly. It is just this very efficient version of that story that doesn't kind of deal with all the bullshit. And then I think to me, like, the key of the series really comes down to Tanjiro as your protagonist. I think he is the thing that feels revolutionary is way too strong of a word, but he's like the most distinctive singular part of it as a shonen production. Is you can think of some characters that are shonen protagonists that are similar to Tanjiro in a couple of ways, but he feels like such a wholly original creation to be the center of one of these kinds of series. He's so thoroughly defined by his compassion, while also being not a saintly type character, right? He also gets incredibly angry. He's not this like one note sort of I forgive everybody kind of thing. He's going to go out there and cut off some fucking heads, but just because he's going to kill them doesn't mean he has to kill them out of spite. And it's like that quality of the main character that is such a key focus, and the like makes this character you just want to see succeed, and you want to follow him on his journey because he's so earnest. It's that one thing. There's like playing Yakuza 7 right now. Like he has a lot of similarities to me with Ichiban. He's like a much smarter Ichiban, but he's got that's a good way to put similar heart to him that is so infectious. And it's the kind of thing where like I can think of stuff like Naruto has a similar sort of character once he's gone through a big character arc. But he has to go through a big character arc to kind of get to the place where Tanjiro is. And there's something about starting with this character that he's got a good fucking head on his shoulders. He's just a good dude trying to figure out what to do. And you just really want to follow him. And then I think he's just a really good sort of vector by which to get these themes about like family and caring and compassion and empathy that are common themes in the genre, right? Like the root of what shonen is as a genre is that like friends are important and hard work are important. Like those are the two things you need to save the world is work really fucking hard and like stick by your friends no matter what. And this show is not different. It is very much about those same things, but I think it like takes that dynamic more seriously than most of these shows do. That's so thoughtful about what family means to Tanjiro, and it's so thoughtful, I think, also about like the mindset one needs to have the like training regimen and to sort of have that amount of dedication that Tanjiro has. It's not just a thing you kind of throw off and he can do. It's something that he has to really incorporate as himself as a human being. And so I think that those elements to me is like really kind of the secret sauce, is that it all comes down to Tanjiro as your protagonist. And I think he is like the thing that makes the show fully tick.
100%. And here's the thing. I think you can say that about any great shonen show.
Yes.
Like, I did a little thread on this, and this is one of my points I made, was that, like, over on Twitter I did this thread, that I think the thing that when you look at shonen shows, there are a million of them, but when you look at the ones that, like, break out and are big and enduring, I think you can usually trace what is special about that show to something in the protagonist, right? Mm-hmm. And it's something that is slightly unique. And a lot shonen protagonists they have similarities. But, you know, like Goku in Dragon Ball brings something very special to the table that while there are many Goku imitators, there is no one quite like Goku. Luffy, I think at the beginning, a lot of people thought was a Goku imitator, and he's really not the deeper you get into One Piece. And Luffy is, like, very unique and marked by... like a lot of like, and the way One Piece is marked by some sadness and some like a meaning of and like a desire for friendship that is much more uniquely defined than it is in a lot of shows. Naruto, like again from the outside looking in, my sense is that a lot of what people love in there is just the fucking arc that like they start with Naruto as annoying as shit and he becomes Naruto Uzumaki, right? Yeah.
He is a character who's like so defined by his trauma and his sense of inadequacy because of how he's been treated since he was a kid, like coming to grow past that insecurity. And then ending the show as the Hokage that he always declared he would be.
Right. And Tanjiro, I think, is defined by his compassion, as you say. But I also think that compassion makes him one of the most unique of all these protagonists, because one thing I tie pretty much every shonen protagonist together with is that they're fucking hot-headed, right? Like, all of them. Like, Goku probably the least, because he's dumb, but like he is still hot. Like Goku is still a hothead, right? He will go off to fight things. But like, because like the shonen protagonist I think is most similar to Tanjiro is probably Ed from Full Metal Alchemist, but Ed is also a hothead who does stupid shit that Tanjiro would never do. And that's not to say Tanjiro doesn't make mistakes or get angry, but he is very not hot-headed. Like Tanjiro is very analytical and he is very compassionate and he is almost always thinking about like, how do we actually get through this? Not just how do I work out my personal feelings in this moment, which is something usually shonen protagonists have to get past, right? Fucking Domon in Mobile Fighter G Gundam has that exact arc of he's a hothead, and at the end he has to learn how to not do that to be a hero, you know? And that is something Tanjiro, how he has to learn to be a hero is a very different thing, and that's something I really love. And it's just he instantly goes into the annals of like shonen heroes who will be around forever because he has something unique that makes you want to follow him. And then the fucking vocal performance by
Hanae Natsuki.
Amazing. And I take it he's a pretty like not up and comer, but he's young and you know he's only 29 and sounds younger. But this is what a fucking like titanically great performance. Oh my god, he's the voice of Jocko, the Galactic Patrolman?
Yes, he is. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I love Jocko. I would not have recognized that. Oh my god, okay, this dude has range. Anyway, yeah, it's such a good performance. It is such a... It's not a typical shonen performance. It's like gentleness and like... He does his screams when he has to, but it's not like the big part of the performance. It is so special. Talking about Hanae Natsuki, I mean, he's a really great voice actor. Like, I think the big thing that he, like, got big with was he played the main character in Tokyo Ghoul. And then he's also the main character in Your Lie in April, or Shigatsu wa Kimi no Uso. There's, like, the two big things that he was in, like, relatively early in his career. I mean, although, he's 1 year older than us, which is, like, whenever I see that, like, born in 1991, it makes me feel inadequate. It's just like, I haven't voiced the protagonist in the most successful anime. Has he done 372 episodes of a variably successful podcast?
No, but let me bring up something. So this is like the other thing that Hanae Natsuki is famous for, is that he's not only, Jonathan, like the hottest shit in Japan in terms of a voice actor. He also has a video game YouTube channel in Japan that has 1.97 million subscribers.
He is better than us, yeah.
Yeah, that's been going for a couple of years, and I just want to shout that out because it is one of my favorite YouTube channels I follow, and some of his most popular videos have been subbed in English by fans, so you can watch those. And in particular, Jonathan, I think you would particularly like a series of videos he's done with some of his other voice actor friends, Ono Kensho and Eguchi Takiya, where they play different like physical either card or board games. But the whole time, and again, these are like some of the most popular young male voice actors in Japan. So it's like they take a certain level of like skill to this approach. They are sort of play acting as if it was a Yu-Gi-Oh! Shadow duel. So like if you lose, you die. The first one they did was of Uno, and I think it's still the best one. And it is one of the funniest videos on the internet because here's 3 professional voice actors in Japan hamming it the fuck up, like doing this sort of like improvised playing Uno, but if you lose, you die. And they're all basically playing like the asshole villain type character. They're great fucking videos.
I am Googling this right now so I can fucking bookmark the shit out of that.
Yeah, it's very good YouTube channel. And I think it's to like his credit as an actor, as I've been like actively watching basically every video they put up. They put like a video up every 2 or 3 days for over a year at this point, because I started watching around the beginning of the pandemic, because I think that he started doing like Animal Crossing videos that got really big, and one of them ended up in my like recommendations on YouTube. And I was like, wait, this is the dude who's fucking Tanjiro in Kimetsu no Yaiba? That's crazy. And started watching the videos, and they're very good. They're very funny. He's got a crew of like other like YouTube video game people from Japan that he plays with. But I've been watching those videos for like a year. Like I have heard way more Hanae Natsuki as himself in those videos than I have him playing characters in an anime. And yet when I started watching Kimetsu no Yaiba a couple of weeks ago, like that, it never even occurred to me. Like it never even was in my head. That's like, oh, this is this guy I've been listening to in these videos forever now. And I think one thing that's remarkable is Hanae Natsuki, like, I've seen a bunch of his major roles. He never really changes his voice that much. He doesn't, like, create a voice for characters as much as, like, he sort of uses more or less his natural voice. And he sort of talked about this in interviews, that's kind of part of his approach, because he feels like that's where he can find his full range as an actor. And it's like, I think it's incredibly impressive that he just sounds like himself when he plays Tanjiro. Like, he doesn't sound like a different person, but the like characterization and personality he so fully embodies that it never occurs to me to even think about that. I've watched this whole like hours and hours and hours of videos of him playing video games on YouTube. That yes, I think it is like one of the most impressive performances in one of these kinds of shows. He has this incredible range. The comedy is super strong. The action, when he has to be super intense, there are a couple of lines that Tanjiro has that I think are these like intense lines that he just nails so hard that when you read them in the manga, it's just like you can recall his entire delivery because it's like he just lands the lines so strong. But then also there's like the kind big brother moments that are like the root of what Tanjiro is. That's like he finds that sweet spot so perfectly. So yes, I think it is like a like legendary performance.
It's so, I mean, it's far from being done, right?
Yeah.
Like, we have probably not even heard I haven't read the whole manga, you haven't read the whole manga. I would imagine the best is yet to come.
That's my impression. My impression is that the movie is not just one of the highest grossing movies in Japan because the show is unpopular. I think it's a really good fucking movie, probably, because like the vague sense I get is like that's where some of like the story, there's some like really good story stuff I think happens in that movie. I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, so we've probably got at least 2 or 3 more seasons. So, but yeah, it's a phenomenal performance, and it's the kind of thing that it's not just every lead actor grounds a show; they have to, right? But like, I think it is the specific way he's able to walk across the different tones. He never gets as silly as like Zenitsu and Inosuke and that kind of stuff. But he has his funny moments. But it's just there's some really heavy stuff in this show he has to do, and there's also just like a lot of. This show leans on internal monologue really heavily. Even if you've seen other anime that have a lot of internal monologue, it's a very common thing. This one has probably more of it than most. During the battles. And that is the kind of thing that I generally don't love. And yet he does it. I think it's because he's the one doing it. He walks you through. And sometimes I do think the show is like a little overwritten in how much they have Tanjiro like talking and explaining things while he's swinging his sword in slow motion. And yet I think he is so good at like projecting desperation in those moments or emotion or something where it's not just he's telling the audience things that they will need to know so that the next action beat makes sense, which in a very utilitarian sense is why that's there, but he is turning it into a character moment. And he does that very consistently. And there's a moment in the whole little, the like haunted mansion part in the middle of the show where one of those little monologues that starts expository turns into like his defining character moment of the season. Mm-hmm. And the way he makes that turn and just brings you to the edge of your seat, even though nothing actually happens in that moment. It's just him getting ready to do something, and then the next episode he does it, is unbelievable. And he just has moments like that across the show. And yeah, it's a really phenomenal performance, and it's one where just again and again I kept thinking like, man, this not that there's like something bad at the core of this, I'm not saying that, but like this is a hard role, and if you didn't have someone doing it this well, this show just fundamentally would have problems. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because like with Tanjiro, one of the dynamics with the character is that like he's smart, right? Like, and he's not like inhumanly smart. He's not a genius character, but it's like he's just got a good fucking head on his shoulders, right? He can be calm and assess things calmly. And you get that insight through the internal narration. But as you say, it is something that could become cloying. But he like makes sure it's always grounded in what is the character feeling? Why is the character like thinking this way? And it kind of, I find those moments very infectious where he's like trying to sort of break down what the enemy is doing. And part of that is also like it gives you these like scenarios of him thinking like, okay, if I do this, no, if I do that, I'll probably die. Okay, instead, let me try this. And you get like his whole logic in what he's doing as he's fighting, particularly for the first half of the show, because that's before you have your kind of full cast assembled and it leans on him super hard. But even then, like, I think, yeah, he finds that sweet spot in the characterization to always make sure that narration is motivated by something that the character is thinking and feeling.
And I like that, he's a character marked by trauma, but not defined by it, which I also feel like is kind of a unique space for a character like this. And he's really good at projecting that too, where there's a lot of sadness in his life. Obviously, episode 1, bad things happen to Tanjiro and his family, but like he is someone who's so fundamentally like forward looking and is about like, well, what do I have and what do I need to protect and like keep? and what do we go forward with, that, you know, it does not wind up sort of bogging him down in a way that I feel like, and this is just good storytelling, it really easily could, right? You could really easily do the version of this where he is flashing back to his dead family every episode, and we've all probably seen that anime and or TV show, and it's just.
I mean, Jonathan, we're doing a whole
slog.
Series of podcasts on Batman movies, so it's like, yes, we've been doing a lot of. Here's like my dead parents, and everything I do in my life is connected to my dead parents.
And isn't that this? And that's the special thing about Kimetsu no Yaiba, right?
Yeah.
Is that it starts with this horrific trauma of his entire family being gruesomely murdered. And instead of him being mired in that moment, what happens is he finds one of them is alive, and he's going to devote everything to protecting and saving that one person and bringing their humanity back. And that's different. That's different than like a Batman approach, right?
Yeah.
That is not Batman going like, and now in honor of my parents, I'm going to make something great out of my life. It's different, and I think that's the key. And this is also a connection to Full Metal Alchemist that I've made, blah blah blah. But like that is the key like engine of the story, is fighting for what's still there, and so it becomes a very present tense story when it could become a very past tense story.
Yeah, and one other thing there with the characterization of Tanjiro in trauma in the show is one thing I appreciate is that like Tanjiro never uses his trauma as like an excuse or like a cudgel to use on other characters, right? He never like directs it at other people. And that's like some of the stuff that's like most heartbreaking. As like one of my favorite scenes from that first half of the show is after he defeats the demon that can like melt into the ground and has like splits himself into three pieces, that's killed a bunch of girls in this town. The guy who's left there, whose fiance has been killed, Tanjiro goes over and is like, I know you must be suffering really hard, but you have no choice. Like, you have to live and you have to move forward. You have to be able to move on. And the kid lashes out at Tanjiro and says, like, what the fuck would you know? You know, like, you're just a little kid. Like, how would you understand, like, the pain I felt? And then Tanjiro just gives him a look. He doesn't even say anything. He just gives them this one, like, sort of look. And that's where, like, it's such a good panel in the manga. That the anime just sort of like replicates as closely as possible to just get this expression from him, and then Tanjiro walks away, and the guy realizes, oh, like here's like this like teenager basically walking around fighting demons with a girl that's also a demon in like a box. Like clearly he has had some shit in his life, and he's like, I'm so sorry. And then Tanjiro just turns around and says, it's fine, and like, bye, and like waves his hand. And this is a beat that is not in the manga that I was so surprised by, but is added in the anime. I think it's like highlights how good ufotable is. Is in the anime, they add an extra beat there where you zoom in on Tanjiro's hands and you see how calloused his hands are, which is something the manga remarks on in the training piece with Urokadaki-san, but doesn't put here. And that's where the guy fully realizes, like, those hands are not the hands of, like, a child, right? They're, like, bruised and cut and calloused and fucked up. And to me, like, Tanjiro's hands, which the anime continues to have that detail whenever it's like clear and Tanjiro's like palms are clear in a frame, they're always more highly detailed than you'd usually have to like get that sense of he has worked so hard to be able to be the person that he is right now, and that being communicated symbolically through his hands, I think is like really potent. Something that I think the anime is smart to sort of lean on even more than the manga does, and just define so much of the character to me in his approach of he doesn't use like how hard he's worked and how bad it's been for him as a way to like hurt other people, but a way to allow him to be empathetic for other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And the motif of the hands is something that's one of my favorite parts of this show, and that they keep bringing it back, and remembering that visual detail is something that I find very, very special in this show. Absolutely. So how do you want to continue this conversation? We wound up talking about Tanjiro. Do you want to just wind up going through the relatively small main cast of season 1?
Yeah, let's talk about some of our other characters. So let's talk about our co-star, Nezuko, voiced by the voice actress Akari Kito, who you might know as, if you've been playing Genshin Impact, as Barbara in the Japanese version of Genshin Impact. Oh. She's you might not be able to notice. Because Nezuko...
because she has like 5 lines across the season?
Yeah, so she has 5 lines across the season, except for she also has like the second like largest speaking part in the entire show, because she is in almost every episode outside of a couple where she's sleeping. It's just most of her dialogue is and which is not to... Yes. Which is like to say that like in many ways she has like the hardest fucking role in the show, because she has to communicate the entire character with growls basically. And yet I do think that Nezuko is like a really, really well drawn character within the reality of the show, even with all those limitations in terms of like you have very little access into her like internal perspective outside of a couple of key moments, and yet like Nezuko feels like such a present character in the show that like I never like sort of bat an eye at the fact that like Akari Kito is always there on the stage. Like if you like see interviews and stuff with the full cast, like she's always given like primacy along with Hanae Natsuki, and I think that's fully appropriate because it's like the character is the other key of the show, and it is like I have to imagine as a voice actor it's pretty fucking hard to play a character like that.
Oh, it must be hard. I would also, for this one, give equal credit to the animators in figuring out how to characterize her visually, because that's primarily her presence in the show, right?
Yeah.
But Nezuko, man, it's an extraordinary gambit here, because so when I've been making my comparisons to Full Metal Alchemist, the basic thing I mean there is that if you know Full Metal Alchemist, the plot of that is that Edward and Alphonse Elric lose their mom. They've lost their whole lives. Ed is an alchemy genius, so he tries to do this human transmutation. It all gets fucked up, and Al loses his body, and Ed loses his arm and leg, and then he has to get Al's body back. And so then he goes and joins the group of genius alchemists and travels around the world trying to figure out the cure for Al and figuring all of that out. Roughly analogous to all the steps in Demon Slayer there. The big difference is that Full Metal Alchemist becomes a two-hander, where Al is still a character who's like active and talking and ambulant and all of that stuff, right? Whereas for this, Tanjiro is very clearly like number one on the call sheet, and then Nezuko is someone who like becomes characterized in much more subtle ways and is sometimes just in a box for episodes at a time. And it's amazing how strong a character Nezuko becomes despite that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Not despite that, like because of that in a lot of ways. Like the tragedy of this is something that becomes actualized, but it also becomes, she is not like, okay, so when the show first started, I was watching the first couple episodes and like, okay, she's a demon. He puts bamboo in her mouth. He's got her in a box. And at first I was a little like, is this going to work? Like that could get really cringy really fast if you did it wrong. If the plot is the brave heroic boy brings his sister around in a box and has to save her a bunch, right? And they very quickly make the decision, or I shouldn't even say they make the decision. I'm sure this was Gotouge's plan from, starting the manga, that's not what Nezuko is going to be. She's actually going to be a character with a lot of agency. It's just not agency that she is able to verbalize necessarily. And so she is someone who has like clear wants and desires and preferences and powers, and she saves Tanjiro as much as he saves her, if not more, like because she's very powerful in her own demonic way. And clearly that's something they're building up for later in the show. And that's really special, and it's something that really makes this story feel unique, even as there are clear, like, antecedents and precedents for this kind of thing, right? And so, yeah, Nezuko is an amazing character and an unbelievably striking character design of this little girl with giant striking eyes and a stick of bamboo in her mouth who is able to, like, growl and look at you, and it feels like her eyes could kill you. Yes,
and she can change size, and it's, like, the most adorable thing in the world. Like, little tiny kid Nezuko. God, the part near the end of the spider arc where Kano is like chasing her through the woods and swipes at Nezuko, and Nezuko shrinks into a little kid and is like running away as a little kid. It is like the most adorable thing you've ever seen in anything ever. But I think like for me with Nezuko, one thing that's really effective about the character is like the way that they try to navigate, like, how does she perceive the world, and like how much like sort of internal reality does she have, and you have that really, really powerful moment at the end of the Tamayo arc where Tamayo asks Tanjiro, why did Nezuko like help us? Like, she was like trained to, or like hypnotized by Urokadaki-san to protect humans and fight demons, so why is she protecting us? And Tanjiro looks at her and says, well, she must have just decided that you're a human. And that's where Tanjiro explains that, he at first, and I think this was like really important to have the protagonist express this, that like he was uncomfortable with the idea of having Nezuko be hypnotized for the whole show, which I think is like appropriately uncomfortable. And Nezuko's like eyes are specifically drawn in a foggy way after she's hypnotized, to like where you're like have a hard time understanding exactly what she's thinking or feeling at times, because she almost looks drunk in a way, because it's the same time you would visualize someone being drunk or drugged, kind of. But then there, like, it being drawn clear in the line that's like, yes, like, she clearly has, like, kind of like a foggy perception of the world in some ways because of what Urokadaki did. But she is expressing her own will. That it's not really humans, demons. It's who she sees as being worth protecting and who she sees as being worth fighting is actually where she draws the distinctions. And that is an expression of who she is and what she chooses for herself. And then having Tamayo cry and then Nezuko go over and pat their heads. It's a really, really important scene, I think, to like grounding that characterization to where you're not being alienated by the character because you can see how she's expressing herself in the world.
Yeah. It's a big narrative gambit, but it is one that pays off in spades.
Yes, and then of course we'll obviously talk about all this super in depth with the end of episode 19, but the fact that she has no speaking lines of like dialogue outside of episode 1 before she's turned until you get her being able to say Kijutsu, exploding blood, and that's like you get some like words that she gets to say again and like make it clear that's like, oh, she has an internal monologue the way that Tanjiro does, and this is like the first window into that you get is her expressing that power.
It's incredible. And because I think you've heard the voice actress, they've let her be a presence in all the like and like little grunts, that you know that voice,
yes.
Even though you haven't heard her say words in so long that you don't remember what it sounds like when it says words, but you just go like, oh yeah, that is Nezuko. They didn't like cast someone for this episode, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely pays off. All right, who next?
Let's talk about our one of our other sword boys, Zenitsu. Agatsuma Zenitsu, played by Shimanohiro, another, like, and all the actors on the show are incredibly good. He's incredibly good as well. He's been in a bunch of stuff. He's not like one of the main characters, but he's a really major supporting character in Attack on Titan. I think is the first thing I saw him in. He's got like that like really good boyish voice that he plays a lot of like young, like kind of shonen type main characters or supporting characters. And he actually
he's Rex in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. That's cool.
The Japanese dub of that. Which I realized I remembered because he is in the trailer for that game, which I saw the Japanese version of. If you're a fan of My Hero Academia, I think like the show that you would, or the role you would never be able to identify as him if you didn't look it up, is he plays a character named Dabi, who's the villain in My Hero Academia who like shoots fire at people. And like it is the most non-Shimanohiro role I have ever seen. Like you would never guess that casting, but he fucking knocks it out of the park. So he's got really good range. But Zenitsu is more like, I think, kind of in his bread and butter of the kind of like major supporting character, or I mean, really he's a main character, but that is like a buddy of the main character that's just a little bit on the annoying side. Like that's kind of the kind of wheelhouse that a lot of his major roles are. But this is where I think you take the like a little bit on the annoying side and you go, it's like, you know, we got to turn that up. Like we have to make him kind of repulsive in some ways because Zenitsu is like the most realistically cowardly character I've seen in this genre ever. Like you have coward type characters sometimes, but there's something about his like. I sometimes find myself not being able to disagree with his assessment of like, I don't want to fucking go on that mountain. I'm gonna get fucking killed. Like no, I don't want to go fight demons. Are you kidding? Because he doesn't have, you know, his family wasn't killed by demons. He wasn't raised on a mountain and doesn't know anything better. He's a poor sap who got tricked by some lady into debt. And this old man played the Shigeru Chiba shows up and saves him from debt and trains him to be a swordsman. And he likes the old man and wants to do good by that old man. But that's his only relationship to this thing. So his like insistence of like, fuck this shit, man. I don't want to do any of this. It's like, I can really sympathize.
I love when you meet him, especially the second time when they come across on the road, like on the farming road. And his whole thing is he is an anime character who doesn't want to be in the anime.
Yeah.
He's like, let me out. I want to be a villager married to this chick over in this town that maybe Tanjiro will go past and say hi to, and that's it. I don't want to be in the anime. What I thought of all the time with Zenitsu. Well, one of my favorite YouTubers is this guy, ProZD, who does a lot of like funny skits and stuff. And he has a skit that is about an annoying anime character, and it's in the skit he and a friend are watching the anime, and there's a character on screen who's like, I'm so scared, I don't want to do this, I'm gonna pee my pants, I'm so scared, and ProZD's friend is like, this is annoying. What the fuck? Why do I want to watch it? And he's like, just watch. Trust me, he gets good. He gets great. And then they like flash forward where he's like, I'm not the man you knew before. I am reliable now. And then it goes back and he's like, now I'm pooping my pants. I'm so scared. And it's a perfect sketch. You should go watch it instead of listening to me trying to recap the sketch. But what I love is that Zenitsu is even sillier than the character in that fucking sketch. Like, they dial it up to 11, and then they keep dialing and keep dialing. And it could be the most annoying thing in the fucking world if Hiroshima was not so goddamn funny. Like, it is such a great comic performance when he is dialing up the comedy. I am just cackling with laughter at some of his, like, cowardice stuff. It is so great. And of course, then you do the thing that anime always are going to do, where he's a coward, and then you find out he's incredibly like cool and reliable, right?
Yes.
Like the one I think a lot of people will know is like Usopp in One Piece is this thing of Usopp's the coward who is really like one of the most loyal and reliable members of the crew and all of that sort of thing, right? And they have lots of fun with that with Usopp, and Kappe Yamaguchi is the patron saint of that kind of character in some sense. But I think like what they do with it here of just like, you've seen this character so many times, let's do the absolute nth degree silliest, but also, as you say, Sean, kind of most realistic version of it, of someone who's just like utterly paralyzed by fear. Let's have Hiroshima go to fucking town on it like he's on stage doing like manzai comedy. It's so good. And then when it's time for the Zenitsu episode where you do his flash, like there's basically one episode, it's like 17 or 18, that's all him fighting that spider as the poison is going through him. It just knocks you absolutely flat. What a great, like, other side of this character we have. And then I think the way the closing training arc kind of starts to reconcile those, man, he's fucking great. I love Zenitsu.
Yeah, it's just it is that character that it would be so easy to get so wrong, but they find that right approach. And I think one thing that makes it work is also the like light horror elements of the series. I think helps make it like more believable that this character is just like, I just know, like fuck this shit completely, right? Because it's like, because most of these series you know, you're like fighting other people, you're fighting ninjas or like martial artists or pirates or whatever. It's like here you're fighting demons, but really you're fighting vampire monsters. Is like basically what the Oni are, and so having that like. I mean, there's a certain level of like gore and violence in both the anime and the manga. Like it's some of the artistic elements of it are in terms of like the mangaka style are clearly pulled from like manga, horror manga. Like there's like clear roots, I think, in some like of Junji Ito's art style that you can see there.
I was about to say that. I was going to say Junji Ito feels like a huge flag point for this.
Yeah, that like it's obviously it's not a full horror manga. It doesn't go like super far with that stuff, but it has just enough of that stuff, especially when you get into the spider section. It kind of reminds you of like, oh right, this can be kind of fucked up. Like what happens to Zenitsu there is like one of the most fucked up things I've seen happen to a fictional character, of getting poisoned and slowly turned into a fucking spider, and his hair's falling out and his limbs are shrinking and stuff. And so having the things they're fighting being so horrific, I think helps you see that side of Zenitsu where you're kind of with them. You're kind of like, no, like these things are dangerous. These things are frightening. Like, yeah, I would not want to fight these fucking things either. But then, you know, there's like fewer more like stand up and applaud moments than at the end of the Manor arc, where Tanjiro's defeated the drum demon and he comes out of the front door of the manor and he sees Zenitsu protecting Nezuko's box from Inosuke as Inosuke's kicking the shit out of him. Especially because the anime does it the same way the manga does, where you don't see any of the progress up to that. That becomes a flashback at the beginning of the next thing. And so, yeah, like that moment where you see that he has been paying attention. He is a good guy. He does care. He just doesn't want to run headlong into his like painful demise. But he has that like real heart of gold. Again, it is not an original character concept, but I think there are a few executed as well as Zenitsu is.
Yeah, it's great. He's a character I'm really excited to see where we go with in the rest of the story. Mm-hmm. I do have a question, since you've actually read the whole manga up to this point.
Yeah.
Is he that exaggerated in the manga too, or do they play it up more in the anime? Because so much of it is so verbal. I was actually wondering about that.
It's played up a little bit more in the anime just because you can have the lines voiced. But no, like it's a pretty consistent characterization. I think the thing that is probably the most sort of dialed up in the anime is more like his prowess as a fighter in those modes, like when he like uses the lightning style or whatever, lightning breathing technique, Hekiraki Isen. When he has those moments, they like really like milk the shit out of it in the anime, which I love. The manga approach to those is really interesting because they basically, or the Gotouge sensei kind of executes it as his attack is so fast that the manga can't capture it, right? If you like think of a manga is compared to a video camera, a manga is like you're taking pictures with a picture camera, and you cannot take a picture that's fast enough and timed well enough to actually see Zenitsu attacking. The 2 times where he uses that move is basically a panel of him, of the buildup, and is a panel of him having cut through the enemy. And you don't get any of the in-between. Obviously, that would not be as, like, as satisfying in the anime, so they, like, make it way fucking cooler, and he's, like, fucking lightning is emanating from him and all that stuff. But that's probably, like, the biggest change to do with his character.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great. And then you have Inosuke, who is the one beating up on Zenitsu when we really get him. Inosuke you see a couple times up to this point, but my favorite thing, Sean, was just watching the theme song in like episode 1, and there's a dude running around with a boar on his head, and I'm like, when are we going to meet that character? I assume he's a main character. He's in the theme song, but I had no idea. I really didn't know anything about this show before I watched it, other than it was super popular. And then you meet him, and Inosuke might be my favorite character in the show. Mostly because Yoshitsugu Matsuoka, the voice actor, I could listen to that guy just read the phone book angrily, and it would be the best thing in the world. That actor is unfucking believable, and I just looked this up. Did you know he holds the Guinness World Record for the most unique sound bites from a voice actor for an exceeded 10,000 words in the mobile game Is It Wrong to Try to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon Memoria Freeze?
I did not know that.
He is famous. Yeah, he is a fast talker, and it is a great performance. It is an amazing idea for a character. That boar head is such an I was about to say prop. It's not a prop. It's animated, but like it is such an amazing expressive thing. He is also like a very clear he is like if Zenitsu is Usopp, Inosuke is Zoro, although a stupider version of Zoro, and dialed up to 11 of the absolute like hothead swordsman who refuses to learn. But it is so well done. It is so silly. It is so out there. And I think the way the spider arc and then the training arc after that, like subtly in the background humbles and humanizes him, is amazing. And I cannot wait to see more of him. And he is my wonderful boar boy, and I love him.
Yeah. So Matsuoka Yoshitsugu is, for my money, in terms of like younger male voice actors in Japan, he's like the best. Like he has such a just like jaw-dropping fucking range. Like his most famous role by far is he is the main character in Sword Art Online. And he has like what is like a stupid number of like starring roles in a bunch of shows. He's also the main character Soma in Shokugeki no Soma, which is also that has like 5 seasons or something at this point. I'm trying to think of like what are some of the other big ones. So he's Bell, the main character from Danmachi, which is the series that has that mobile game you just read off. He has so many huge credits. He is also known to you, Jonathan, as the voice of Zhao or Sho in Genshin Impact, the like demon boy with the wind spear. So that is him.
Yes, that's why I wanted that character so badly.
Yeah.
Didn't fucking get him.
Yeah,
fuck you, Genshin Impact.
That was the one where, like, when I saw that casting, I'm like, man, they are really fucking serious with this game in Japan, because it's like, this dude is super in demand. Again, he has, like, so many main leading roles. He's also a Beetlejuice in ReZero, which is a very popular show, and that is, like, a villain character that is a, like, dialed up to 110% type villain. So, yeah, he's, like, an incredibly versatile actor, and Inosuke is maybe my favorite thing he's done. I find Inosuke the most raucously funny fucking character in anything.
So funny. That
whole protracted encounter between him and Tanjiro is just incredible. The moment where, like, so they're fighting and he's super flexible, right? And so he's able to, like, he's like fighting super low and all of this. And Tanjiro's like, I can't. The only way to counter this is by going even lower, and that's where he does like the double like Jean-Claude Van Damme like splits all the way to the ground, and like beats Tanjiro back. And then he says, I can even do this, and he bends all the way backwards and sticks his head up from underneath his legs. And then Matsuki Yoshitsugu gives this fucking cackle that is the funniest thing in the world. This dude, he's so happy to be who he is. He's having so much fun running around and jumping and fighting and like showing off like this weird shit. And because he's this weird like mountain boy who grew up with like, you know, raised by wolves basically, or raised by boars, I guess. And the backstory of that, how he ended up as a Demon Slayer member, is that a Demon Slayer wandered into the mountain where he lived. He beat the shit out of him, heard about what this selection thing was, stole the guy's swords, broke the swords with rocks to make them all jagged and cool looking, and just ran up the mountain and ran back down the mountain and won the final selection thing. It's such a funny fucking character. And then also, I think for me, what is the funniest moment in the whole show, because I think Kimetsu no Yaiba is like mostly like sort of lauded for like the great action scenes and that kind of stuff, but I think it also, the humor is so well dialed in, particularly once you have all three of these characters together. And the sequence when they're coming down from the mountain after the manor bit, and I know
what you're gonna say.
And Inosuke is like, come on, fight me, you. And then Tanjiro looks at him and says, my name, I'm not you. My name is Kamado Tanjiro. And it just cuts directly back to Inosuke. He says, Kamaboko Gonpachiro, I will defeat you. It's just like, who the fuck is that? It's you. No, it's not. And then Zenitsu just says, like, shut the fuck up. What are you people talking about? Like, the bickering between these characters and the running joke of Inosuke not being able to remember Tanjiro's name and coming up with the most ridiculous shit, Kamaboko Gonpachiro, which is the funniest name ever uttered in the Japanese language. It is such a great dynamic.
It's so good. And okay, so we haven't talked about maybe my favorite fucking thing in this show, which is the next episode previews, which are just so perfect, where at the end of every episode, and they don't actually do next episode previews. They don't ever show you footage. What they do is they just have like manga panels that look like actual Weekly Shonen Jump, like the green like recycled paper, and they have that, and they have like basically still animations with like very like stiff mouth movements, and they just basically do like little manzai comedy buddy routines, and they're so funny. And the best one is between Tanjiro and Inosuke, where he just keeps throwing names at Tanjiro until he finally gets it by accident. And that one made me laugh harder than any of them, but I love all of those. I love that with Inosuke. I love his whole thing where he keeps throwing his head into fucking different trees and just banging it against trees. I think in the whole show, no moment probably got a bigger laugh out of me than when he gets the beautiful new swords at the end of like the series, and then he takes the swords and puts them down and just starts hitting them with rocks and banging holes into them. And it's just like the timing on that is so good, of him like so earnestly like, these are great, but they're missing one thing, giant fucking holes.
Yeah, him like walking with the swords over by this lake, and he sits down and he picks up a couple of rocks and looks at them and like throws them away, and the dude who made the sword is just like, so what are you doing? And he just starts banging on the sword. I mean, one thing I think is kind of an interesting visual change. I think this is probably just made because it's easier for the anime, where the like jagged thing in his sword is very consistent in the anime. In the manga, it's just fucked up. Like, it's just a fucked up looking sword. It is like, it's kind of even funnier to me, because in the anime, you look at those swords, you're like, oh, they kind of look like they would be able to do like a type of like kind of attack almost that a normal sword couldn't. In the manga, it's just like, no, you're just fucking that sword up. Like, there's nothing productive about what you're doing. But yes, that bit is incredibly funny.
It's great. I love that he runs around with swords with no hilt, and he just like fucking wraps the like still sharp edge and holds on to that because he's a nut job. No, he is unbelievably funny. That performance is out of this world good. I can't imagine this show without him. And if you had told me that after like episode 1, after like watching Tanjiro's family fucking get brutally murdered and then him defending Nezuko, and then you told me the guy with the pig on his head is going to be your favorite, I would look at you and go, what the fuck are you talking about? But no, because the whole idea of having these big, funny, out there characters who also then you learn they have like dramatic interiority and are really sad inside. That's anime 101.
Yeah.
Everyone does that. But this show does it so well, where we have not gotten the like fully articulated Inosuke flashback and learned all of this, but the one where he is fighting the big spider dad and the guy has his like hand on his head and is like crushing his fucking skull, which I could barely watch because I found that so grisly. And Inosuke is having these flashbacks to like pieces of his past. You can just tell this character's going to make you cry at some point too.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's so great. I cannot wait to be sitting in a theater next week watching him in the movie and laughing along with a theater full of people. That will be very good for my soul.
Yes.
After this last year.
Yeah, one other Inosuke moment I really love is after they get back from the whole spider arc, and then he's just in the bed. I think it's like a really good introduction to that scene, because I just read the manga part of the scene last night. It's like it's stuck in my head because the manga does it the same way, where Tanjiro is carried into that room, and he has the whole conversation with Zenitsu, and he says, "Zenitsu, where's Inosuke? Is he here too?" And then he says, "Yeah, he's been here the whole time." And then just you get an image of him lying in the bed. It's a good his characterization there, where they start developing him more, of where he's realized, I'm not like the toughest shit in the world. Like I got my ass kicked, and then fucking Cloud from Final Fantasy VII showed up and killed the guy in one hit. It's like maybe I'm not the strongest dude in the world. But what Matsuoka Yoshitsugu does, I don't even know how the fuck he makes this voice, but the voice he makes with like Inosuke's crushed throat, how like gravelly and fucked up it is, where he says like, "I'm sorry for being weak," is both very funny and then also very sad because you see how depressed he is. But like the sound, like the vocal quality he hits, and that's part of what I mean when I say that I think he's the most impressive voice actor. He has like some of those roles, particularly when he plays a supporting role in like smaller role in other shows, they tend to give him characters that just like ask for this vocal quality that is very like odd. And he's just so good at producing those sounds while also being like a guy who can just be the protagonist of a shonen thing or the protagonist of a romantic comedy, which he is like of like 5 major big romantic comedy series. He's the main character. He can both do your like normal protagonist character, and then he can also let me do the crazy fucked up crushed throat voice that I've never heard a voice actor give, like a voice that sounds like that before.
I love the idea of thinking about this guy like in the booth, and he's doing like a marathon recording session for maybe a couple different shows, and he like ends doing like Sword Art Online, just normal voice, and like okay, now you're doing Inosuke. He's like, okay, give me just a second, and then he probably like puts his hands on his hips and goes ah ha ha ha, or something like crazy, like one of his dumb cackles to like get his voice ready, and that would be so fun to watch him like jump between those. Oh man, it's great. And again, that visual design, because they don't shy away from showing you his face like early on and once in a while just to remind you there's a person under there and he's very good looking, which is the joke. Yes. But like, I love that they just keep that fucking boar head on all the time, and it is so silly. And I love that also like Tanjiro and Zenitsu just kind of accept it after like initial confusion. They're just like, okay, our friend wears a boar head on his face, and it's dumb and funny.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a like a really striking character design. Yeah, the boar.
This show has it all.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Who else?
So that's where I think we start moving into some of the supporting characters. So I want to talk about Shinobu a little bit because I think while she's not a main character, she might secretly be my favorite character in this show. There's something I find just so fascinating about her. So she's the butterfly woman. She's the bug pillar, or the Mushi Bashira of the Hashira of the Demon Slayer organization. And yeah, so she's voiced by Hayami Saori, who's the voice actor I really like. She's in a lot of really good stuff, including in a couple of Fate adaptations as well. But she just has this like fine line between like utterly sadistic, but like really enjoying herself, and also being angry at the same time, right? Like she has this very pleasant sounding voice, but she's just saying the most like dark, fucked up shit. Like when she is talking to the sister demon, and saying like, oh yeah, like I'll forgive you. All you have to do is repent for all the people you've killed. And she's like talking through this. So how many people have you killed? And the demon says like, oh, 5. And it's like, really, 5? Interesting. I found like 30 of these cocoons on the west side of or she starts it with, I came from the west side of the mountain. The west side of the mountain. There are 30 of those cocoons. And like the way she walks through that process, knowing that she's not just going to kill this demon, but the way she kills them which is, it's so good because her whole thing is that she wants to get like, quote unquote, get along with the demons or find like a more humane way to deal with them, because that's what her older sister wanted before her older sister was killed. And so she's trying to find a way to kill demons without having to cut their heads off. And so she's developing this poison made out of like the flowers, that the wisteria flowers they don't like. But right now what she's actually doing is poisoning them, and it's a way more horrific fucking death than any other demon has had, other than the demon who says Muzan's name and gets ripped apart by her own body. Like the way the demon like convulses and screams and like just like passes out. And even then, it like the poison doesn't even really kill them. They just get paralyzed so that the fucking sun will melt them when the sun comes up. It's like the most horrifying way to kill these things. And it's that, like, those inherent contradictions of the character of, like, pleasant on the outside, really kind of the most sadistic and angry character we've met. But she is, like, trying to be not that. Like, she wants to be the pleasant person that she projects. I just find the characterization so compelling.
Oh, I'm so fascinated to see where it goes, because the scene you're describing, I found that, along with Muzan Kibutsuji's scene in the finale, to be the two most disturbing scenes in the whole show. I think Shinobu's like verbal torture followed by very literal torture of the sister demon is just unbelievably hard to watch, but in the best way. And it's that performance. Because like we've all heard the version of the, nice, like pleasant voice who's saying fucked up shit. That's a common trope, not just in anime. But I think there's something specific about how it is written, how far it goes, how controlled the actress is there. It's out of this world. And then I would have predicted after that point that she would be like a pretty heavy obstacle for Tanjiro and like maybe even an antagonistic kind of force. But she's not. She actually does have this incredibly nice side. And that is such a more complicated way to do that character, where like she does want to do good. And I do think she thinks she's being nice to that demon, but she is unbelievably cruel in that way too. And that is a really interesting, it's one of those things that like, I'm very excited to read the manga or see the rest of the show when it's eventually made, where that character goes, because it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and you have, because I think the way she's depicted in the manga, like it's just such a strong character from the start. I mean, it's partially the character design, I think, is incredibly striking. The way, like, when she's fighting the sister demon, her howdy, her, like, sort of outer coat has these, like, long sleeves that come down that have, like, a butterfly pattern, and she, like, pulls her arms into the sleeves, which is, like, a common thing. It's the same thing that, like, you get in, like, Yojimbo and stuff like that, of, like, this, like, this, like, interesting visual of a character pulling their sleeves into their kimono. But then while she's jumping around, it creates this visual of a butterfly because of how big the sleeves are. I think it's just a very striking character design that I find the character very mesmerizing, both in the manga, just the way she's written, the way she's drawn. But then when you add Hayami Saori's performance on top of that, it is just, a really striking character that then has that great scene with her and Tanjiro on the roof where Tanjiro like can smell her anger. Is like he just turns to her and says like, "Are you angry right now?" And she just is like really struck by that. Great character, great scenes.
It's great. It's actually funny when you look at all the Hashira. I hadn't even realized they just like went out and found all the most famous voice actors. It's an amazing assemblage. So you have like, Giyu is Takahiro Sakurai, who's Cloud. You have Sanemi is Tokokazu Seki, who we've talked about many times because he's Domon in G Gundam and he's in everything. You have Kenichi Suzumura as Obanai, the snake guy. It's just an incredible, like, stacked cast that I assume all of these people will have big things to do in the future. So far, most of them have only had a couple of lines, obviously. But I'm very excited to see all of them in action. We're going to see Fire Guy in the movie, obviously, because he's on all the posters, and it's a setup at the end of the season. But yeah, it's cool. I'm excited to hear from some of these people.
Yeah, it is like a who's who of great voice actors when the Hashira show up. Because you can tell they're like, we need to make sure we cast really good people in case the show like gets big enough that we're going to like be able to have more content, and it definitely got big enough that they're going to have more content.
Oh man, Kana Hanazawa is the love Hashira. She has like the most lines in those episodes. She's fucking funny in those too, where she's just she loves everything but loves it all like in very specific ways. It's great.
Yeah, and I'm particularly excited to see more of Satoshi Hino's performance as Rengoku, the fire pillar. In the flame pillar, I should say. Apparently they're specific about that. In the movie, because the because you get a little bit more of him, I think, than some of the other Hashira, in that, like, the way that he is, along with some of those other Hashira, that he's on the side of, like, no, we should just execute Tanjiro, like, fuck this shit, like, he's with the demon, but he's kind of like Shinobu. He's so pleasant about it, he's so earnest and, like, energetic. His whole attitude is just it's when the man of the house, or like the master of the mansion, however you want to like translate that character's name, the leader of the demon slayers, is saying, like, I think we should I have given Tanjiro permission to have, like, with the whole Nezuko situation, like, I want you guys to accept it. And he is the first character to just say, with all due respect, but I can't understand what you're saying at all. And he just says it in that tone of voice, is like, I don't know even what you mean when you're saying that. It's a really great character. And I know that, like, that's another one of those things where it's like, from what I've heard from people in Japan, like, everything I've heard from when people go see the movie, they come out of it and they fucking love that character to death. So I'm really excited to see more of him, because I think he's probably very, very good.
But God, I'm just scrolling through the list of credits, and I didn't realize how many famous people are in this show. Like, just down to, like, the Swordsmiths are Daisuke Namikawa and Eiji Takamoto.
Yep.
They have, like, 10 lines across the show, but that's amazing that you would get both of them. Just everyone in it. We haven't talked about, like, Tanjiro's mentor yet. Who voices him, the trainer?
It's Hochu Otsuka, who's he is Chibney Crockett in G Gundam. Probably not the thing he's most remembered for, but he's Jiraiya in Naruto. He's Naruto's mentor, as long as, like, he's in a bunch of other stuff. But yes, Urokodaki-san.
Urokodaki, I love Urokodaki. He's great. I love his crazy mask. It's great.
Yeah, they got Shigeru Chiba to be Zenitsu's old man, or his mentor. Junichi Suabe, who's a actor I really like. He's the drum demon. They got Uchiyama Koki, who's Banaji from Gundam, Unicorn Gundam. He's Dewey, the spider demon. He's one of the Juni
that's
Kizuki.
A great performance, man. That is a creepy ass character. He's great.
Yeah. So yes, it's like a ridiculously stacked cast. I think the funniest ones are, because I didn't realize this until I was looking up the cast earlier today. All of Tanjiro's siblings who have, like, literally, like, 1 or 2 lines in the first episode, they're all voiced by, like, big voice actors. So you have Koga Aoi, who is Paimon in fucking Genshin Impact, voices the littlest brother. Konohama Kohara, who's one of the main characters in Kaguya-sama Love is War. She's one of the little kids. So it's like all of them. Hoko Kawashima, who is Flay from Gundam Seed, she's the mom. So it's like all of those characters too. And then, of course, Lacon Stratos himself is Tanjiro's dad. So you've got a lot of big Gundam Seed, Double O Gundam people. And it's just like, here's these, like, one-off characters. Let's go get, like, pretty big name voice actors to play all those characters.
Apparently, ufotable has had one major controversy in its life of some tax evasion. I wonder if, like, that they kept their taxes and just gave them to all these big actors to come in and do one line.
Yeah, I wonder if there's, like, a big sequence later in the series or something that's, like, a big flashback with those characters, because there must be a reason why you'd cast those actors when, like, really the siblings only show up. They have, like, one line apiece in the first episode, and that's it.
They're there to die, Oh, man. Well, okay, so we knocked out the characters. Do you want to break down some of the major, fights or moments in the series?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about it, because I think we kind of, like, hit a couple of points around the show. But I do want to talk about the first episode, which is a really tight adaptation of the first chapter in the manga, which is, like, a double-length chapter as sort of, like, the pilot. And I do think it's just, like, such a great, tight story. It's especially reading the manga, I think it's, like, quite striking, because it does, obviously it is not designed to be, like, a one and done, but it is kind of built to be like, we need to construct what feels like a full story over the course of what is, like, about 50 pages of manga, to, like, hook people into this world. And I think it's so efficient at setting up a bunch of the major concepts, all of our major characters with Tanjiro and Nezuko, Tanjiro going down to the village, him on his way back, stopping in that one old man's house. He says, like, don't go up on the mountain at night, tells him about the demons, and then Tanjiro goes back and finds his entire family killed. Like, I just think that whole structure, it works, like outside of then the conclusion being, and then Tanjiro's like Nezuko's actually okay, and Tanjiro's gonna like go train to be a demon slayer. Like if it had a dark ending where Tanjiro is killed or something at the end, it would just be a one-off horror story. It's like what makes it not a horror story is the fact that like the Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, Gyu, decides not to kill him and actually spare him and like give him an opportunity for a future. Like that's the only thing that stops this from just being a like one-off horror story. And I think that like structure works incredibly well at kind of bringing you into this whole world.
It's a very narrow slice of what the show will become. You know, there's a lot of anime pilot chapters. I mean, this is very common in manga that you start with your like 60-page chapter, and you know, in a lot of those, you will see a nice little cross section of what the story is going to become. And this one is not that. It's a very, like, there's not a lot of other episodes of the show that are like that first episode. It's very small scale, focused, dark. There's no hint of humor in that first episode. I don't know how you would integrate that in this one. That would be really hard. And it works very well because of that, I think. It makes you want to watch. And like, certainly my question watching that first episode when I watched it was like, this is great. I'm really curious what the show is. You know what I mean? Because it does not give you that indication. It is like this short story. And then you have to go and you're going to realize, okay, so he's going to join this organization and fight demons. And I've seen this kind of shape before, but you don't necessarily know outside of that first chapter. And that gives it a very distinctive feel. And of course, it fits to a 25-minute anime episode more or less perfectly, as these things sometimes do. But it's great. It's a very strong start.
Yeah, in that regard, I think the thing it's most similar to is Yu Yu Hakusho, which has a similar, like, the first story arc, which in that case is like 2 or 3 episodes, but is like entirely about the main character dies, he is a ghost. How does he come back into his body? And then the rest of the show is about now he's like contacted and like he's like part of the spirit world. Now he has to fight demons and evil ghosts and stuff as like the spirit detective. But yeah, I think it's like a similar concept that works really well of let's just get like a tone and a style in our main character, nail them in this like broadly kind of standalone story, and then use that as your entry point into now let's expand it out into something that's a more familiar shonen style structure.
Yes. And as good as that is, I will say the moment that sold me on the show, if we're like going forward, like what made me think, now I see why this is so special, for me is during final selection.
Yeah.
And it is when, well, first off, I think the third episode, which is about those 2 kids who were Urokadaki's like disciples who got killed during final selection, and then Tanjiro fights him and he winds up cutting the rock. I thought that was really good. Like that made me sit up and take note, like, okay, now they're cooking. But then it is final selection when Tanjiro has his first big battle and finds the opening thread for the first time, and they kind of introduce the format that a lot of these fights are going to take. And then at the start of the following episode, he goes and like puts his hand on the dying demon and sees its entire life story. And that was where I went, oh, this is why Demon Slayer is one of the biggest things in the world right now, isn't it? And I really do think that is my thesis. I do think like the action and the animation and the humor and all these things we've been talking about are great, but I do think the ultimate one thing that makes this show so fucking special is Tanjiro's compassion, and the idea of defeating a demon is not the most important moment in that relationship with the demon. It is the moment he reaches out afterwards and empathizes. And I'm really glad as the show goes on that is not just something I picked up on early that I liked. It is the central thing to the show.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is the show was actually originally shown as, so there was like a brief limited tour of the first 5 episodes effectively edited into a movie. With you're kind of talking about the 5th episode is when he gets the sword and all of that.
Right.
And like actually, I think there's like a couple of the arcs were edited into movies in different like formats, because it is like very arc focused, and it's very easy to like imagine like it being just divided up into different movies. I think it's one of the reasons why it's very easy to imagine how the Mugen Train movie is going to work as a movie. But yes, that like, I think that works so well, those first 5 episodes, as that's really what the formula of Kimetsu no Yaiba is, right? You get your little training bit, you get your sort of empathy from Tanjiro, you get your big demon fight, and then you end that fight with him, as you say, holding his hand. And it's the first time you get that like sense of Tanjiro's empathy as one of his main sort of character traits. And then I think like, and I do feel like that is a very intentional choice to have that structured that way, because I think that's also to basically where the end of the volume 1 is about there. because that's also where it ends with him getting the sword, right? It's important to remember the series is named after the swords. It's called Kimetsu no Yaiba. So like I think there's like a pretty conscious, like it's building up to him getting his own sword, and that's like where the story of Kimetsu no Yaiba really starts, is once he gets his own Nichirin-to sword.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I would very much recommend, I probably should have said this earlier, because if you're still listening, you've probably seen the show. But if you were starting the show, I would recommend carve out time and watch the first 5. Like, that's really, you want to, like, sit down and digest those, and then you will totally know if you are on board with this or not, right?
Yes, yeah, because that's basically how I watched it the second time, since I knew what the story was and where the arcs fell, is basically, like, I would sit down and watch whatever that arc was, 5 or 6 episodes, and I'd be like, that's my Kimetsu chunk for a day, and I did that basically every day of spring break and watched through the whole show. And it's like, that's like kind of like the way I would recommend consuming it. Obviously, it's hard to do that when you don't know where the breaks are going to be because you haven't seen it before, but yeah, it's well structured in that arc format. As well as, like, I think one thing that stands out about the anime, when we talk specifically about episode 19, is the most successful of this, but it also finds really strong ways to build these stories into episodes that I think is another standout thing that a lot of other shows in this genre are not often very good at that. And they just feel too heavily serialized and not focusing on what is the shape of this one 22-minute like chunk of TV. And I think Kimetsu no Yaiba is very good at that, quite consistently.
I agree, because I actually didn't do a lot of long binges with this show. Like, I think the most I watched in one sitting was 3. And it's because I think the episodes are just so successful at that oftentimes I would watch 1 or 2 and I would feel like I got such a full, like, meal I needed to go digest it. Like, episode 19 is the most extreme example of this, but I sat down to watch episodes 18 and 19 and I was planning to watch much more than that night. And then I saw episode 19 and I went, okay, well, I'm turning off the TV now. I can't digest any more than that. And I went and, like, took a little walk and took a shower. I was just like, I need to, like, just do something where my head is just thinking about this, you know? And that's a mark of very effective TV structuring.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you want to go through do you want to talk about the animation? Do you want to talk about some of the big, like, fights and the different ones that are maybe our favorites? Although they're all good.
Yeah, they're all very good. I do think so. Like, for me, I think the show, there's a pretty clear moment where, and I think this is actually kind of true of the manga as well, because I think you get to the Manor story arc, and that's where, to me, like, Kimetsu no Yaiba fully takes shape. I think, like,
I agree.
If there's, like, a weakness, I think it's that, like, little intermittent period there. Like, it's the kind of like the Tamayo-san section is not bad, but it feels like it's a little bit, like, not sure fully where it's going.
That's one of those that, because I agree, and I think there is some really great stuff there. Like, I mean, him just bumping into Muzan Kibutsuji in the city when they're there. They're in Asatsuka, right? Or something?
I think they're in Tokyo.
Oh, I thought they were in Asakusa.
I might be wrong. Anyway, I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm looking it up right now. They don't say on Wikipedia. That's okay.
They're in a major Japanese city.
They're in a major Japanese city. But anyway, like, I love all of that. And the whole, like, that episode where it's called Muzan Kibutsuji, where he meets him and, like, sees him and, like, he's basically, like, Pride from Full Metal Alchemist, and he's got a family, and it's like, oh my god, this is crazy. And I was like, wow, this is crazy, this is great. And then I do think the one after that, like, I think it's, like, maybe just a little too long, and the whole fight with, like, the arrows and stuff is a really cool idea that felt to me like something that probably worked better on the page, and I don't know if it fully, like, felt like it's, like, somehow too slow in how it's visualized for it to have all the full power for me. I think it's cool, but whatever. But then I agree that the manor, and I specifically think the fight in the manor with the guy with the drum hitting, like, that's where ufotable, I feel like, fully, like, just goes for the jugular and hooks you with, like, this is what we are capable of doing. Bow down to us mortals. And that's what it feels like once you get out of the manor stuff.
Yeah. So it's definitely, the manor where, and it's that thing where, like, so that's where ufotable starts putting in more of their own stuff. So up to that point, like, it is a very, very close adaptation of the manga. Obviously, you're filling in, like, action beats and stuff. But it's very, 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 very close. And then once you get to the manor, that's where they start pulling out more of, like, let's put more of the ufotable kind of touch onto these sequences, and less relying on like the manga as your sort of basically your storyboards of the sequence, and more using that as inspiration for and like the basis of what is happening, but let's find our own way to kind of portray it. And I think that that's very smart because, I mean, that the sequences in the manga are good, but the manga's ability to portray the concept of rooms shifting and like moving around and gravity changing is relatively limited. And I think that that's what, like, there's one section, like a couple of pages particularly, that I think don't work super well in the manga there because it's too busy. It's too much trying to show how much is moving. And I think it sort of loses some of the simplicity. But like the core idea of that sequence and that whole area is so strong, right? Of having this, again, like it's very got that horror root to it. Of you have this monstrous demon who has these Tsuzumi drums embedded in his body. And when he hits the drums, the room shifts or you get transported somewhere else. So you're stuck in this manner. And it's such a strong conceit. And then what ufotable does, and this is where you can see very much the impact of their technique of blending 3D backgrounds with 2D animation. They get some 3D camera type shots in there that are just, I think, some of the like the best looking shit. And some of it is like very flashy. I think one of my favorite shots is the one at the very beginning of that sequence where Tanjiro and the little girl are kind of separated and they're standing in the middle of the room and you have an orbital camera spinning around them. And as it's spinning, you get the Tsuzumi drum beat happening. Every time you get the beat, the background just flashes to a different background. And that would be a shot that if you were doing that in traditional 2D animation, it would be phenomenally expensive to animate the background to be able to have an orbital camera movement like that, especially when you're switching the background, which backgrounds are highly detailed in animation. And so using your 3D elements to make that way more practical while still showing off how talented their 2D animators are with the expressions on Tanjiro's face, like how perfect the camera movement is replicated by animating Tanjiro. It is just like, I mean, all across, I think is impressive. That shot is one of the ones where when it happens at the beginning of that arc, you're like, oh shit, ufotable showed up and like they're here to fucking play.
Yes. So can we let's just talk about the animation.
Yes.
And it's incredible. There's so many layers of it. The first thing that struck me starting to watch the show is I think this might be the most effective like adaptation of a manga character design style into moving animation I've ever seen. And actually, the character designs are actually a little more refined than they are in the manga from what I've seen. You've read more of the manga. They feel a little more like finished and like fleshed out in this. But they do look like very hand-drawn. And not just hand-drawn, but they look hand-drawn by like a person at their desk in the way manga is, you know? And they go down to like having things that are usually taken out in anime adaptations, like Gotouge often draws Tanjiro with like little lines on his face to kind of show a furrowed brow or something, and they keep that in the anime. And they keep a lot of those little sort of manga signifiers that you usually cut out, and so it feels extremely handcrafted. And this is something like digital animation has been moving towards a lot in recent years. Tatsuya Nagamine has done a ton of this at Toei with like Dragon Ball Super and the Wano arc of One Piece, and now the Dragon Quest anime, where you have these like line filters that allow you to do this more. But the whole anime industry is doing a lot more of it. But this is, I think, the best version of that I've seen, where it just looks exquisite. And then you have these backgrounds that are just unbelievably like detailed and beautiful in this show. But that's the 2D side of it, because then you get to the 3D side of it, and I think this is an incredible discussion worth having, because obviously the whole idea of like what does anime become when you have 3D elements is a fraught topic, and it has been fraught since like the early 2000s when you start seeing this in stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like what you can do with digital animation, it's taken on a bunch of different guises. There is the straight up just integrating CGI into anime, which no one ever really likes when it's just sort of clumsily like, here's CGI, right?
Yeah.
And you have using computers to do stuff that actually looks more hand-drawn. Isao Takahata has done this in My Neighbors the Yamadas and The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, which are going for a really handcrafted look that maybe paradoxically couldn't be done without the aid of computers, you know? But it is not breaking sort of the normal like visual codes of anime in that sense. And then you have what ufotable is going for. You also have just straight up 3D CGI anime, like the new Lupin the Third movie, which is phenomenal and fascinating and really interesting to look at. But then you have what ufotable is doing here, which is a really clear blend that is often fairly segregated, where when they kick into a sequence that's going to use a 3D camera, the sequence uses it. It's
Yeah.
not like a shot here and then you go back and it's really herky-jerky. It's a very fluid sense of how this works. So, Sean, do you mind if I bring in some film theory into this?
Go ahead. This is why we
Okay.
have this podcast, is for us to just talk about the bullshit we like. And you obviously are getting your PhD in film studies,
Yes.
so probably you should talk about it.
So this was on my mind watching the whole show because I recently, if you haven't heard recent episodes, I talked about this. I sat for my comprehensive PhD exams, which is where you make up these giant reading lists and then you sit for 3 separate 4-hour tests, 12 hours of testing total, where you write 9 overall essays in response to big theoretical and historical questions. And one of the readings I encountered that I really loved was by a guy named Thomas Lamar. It's his book, The Anime Machine. That people should, well, it's very dense, but it is worth reading because he does the best job rigorously theorizing anime I've seen an English language scholar do. Like, by far, most anime scholarship is utter fucking garbage in English, and his is really good. But so I'm going to read from one of my test answers I did because this is better than me just talking off the cuff. I actually wrote and quoted and stuff. So let me go through this. I'm going to start with, so what I was writing about in this test answer was about sort of ways to theorize animation in the digital age, and like as the word animation has become kind of fraught in film studies because there's this whole theoretical basis to it. But I'm talking about the scholar Tom Gunning, who's very famous, and he argues for this separation of animation into 2 meanings. Animation 1, which is just the basic machinic creation of cinema, where all cinema is animation because it's still images that you move fast and then it's an illusion of motion. And then animation 2 is what we commonly associate, which is drawings, puppets, bits of paper, clay, things that are not animate, but we make move. And this is very relevant to Western film animation studies because there's a whole debate of like, well, isn't all film animation? What do we mean when we say animation? And it's, it's a very insular subject. So Tom Gunning has those 2. But then I pick up here, and this is where I'm going to quote from myself. Gunning's verbal separation is a useful thought framework, but unworkable in discussion or conversation. Saying or typing animation 1 and animation 2, especially over a long period of time, obfuscates its own usefulness. For this practical reason, as well as offering a deeper, richer, and more workable framework for thinking, I prefer Thomas Lamar's dichotomy between what he calls the cinematic and the animatic in his book, The Anime Machine. For one, Lamar is one of the few animation theorists to use Japanese anime as the material base of his theory, which, as he points out, is necessary given that Japan is the largest producer of animation in the world and the only large-scale animation movement that accounts for both the influences of Hollywood history and hegemony, while also striking its own distinct path, therefore allowing us to see the inherent differences in the possibility of animation more starkly. This is where the term animatic comes from, which he contrasts with the cinematic, 2 proposed tendencies of film style. The animatic, based around the stable apparatus of cell animation's animation stand, is based around compositing multiple planes of the image, as is central to cell animation, and focuses on movement on or between surfaces. The cinematic, which is based around the mobile apparatus of the camera, focuses on movement into depth. These 2 tendencies are generally aligned with animation and live action respectively, but they do not have to be, as either form of filmmaking can aim to embrace one tendency or both based on a given situation. This framework is of great use historically and is particularly valuable in today's discussions on digital technologies' impact on live action filmmaking. As Lamar points out, today's spectacle-driven, CGI effects-heavy live action films are increasingly concerned with matters of compositing so central to the visual and ideological dimensions of the animatic, to which I would add animated CGI films in Hollywood and increasingly China, which are increasingly interested in harnessing the cinematic, perhaps best exemplified by the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy, which hired Roger Deakins, the legendary cinematographer, as a visual consultant, going to great lengths to mimic cinematographic visual techniques and being less concerned with compositing. I talk about some other examples here, but then just for one other later in this, I'm talking about Hayao Miyazaki in particular, who he uses. Lamar positions Miyazaki's craft and style within his cinematic animatic framework, wherein Miyazaki is posited as exemplary of the animatic. Compositing, the relationship between layers of animation in the traditional cell process, is the core of Lamar's framework, and Miyazaki's style is here examined at length, presenting the director as a master of open compositing, exploiting space between the layers rather than attempting to flatten the distance between them, whose use of space and positionality reflects Miyazaki's thematic and ideological view of the world. And there's a whole thing about this I could get into, but that kind of gives you an idea. And this is such a useful thought framework. Like, this is where theory is actually very useful in film studies, because it gives you a way to describe what we mean when we say, like, standard anime. Because, like, standard 2D anime is not made anymore in the way it was in 1970 with like layers of cells and a bunch of people hunched over at desks doing a billion drawings completely by hand. You have a lot of that, but now computers have taken over so many of these tasks. You don't actually film animation, you scan it. There's all sorts of different things going on. And yet the fundamental visual codes of, say, Gundam 00 are the same fundamental visual codes of Mobile Suit Gundam 1979. Yeah. It is animatic. It is based on compositing. It is not like, one way to think of this, it's oversimplified, but movement into depth is cinematic, and movement kind of across or between surfaces is animatic. And that is what most anime and animation does. But this is where I wanted to bring it in with Kimetsu no Yaiba, because this gives us a really great way to think about it, because Kimetsu is very thoughtful about where it is animatic, and it is about compositing, and it is a very traditional animation style, the codes of which we are, if you watch any amount of anime, you're just super used to how these things look. And then when it bursts into motion in this 3D space, it abandons that and becomes very cinematic and becomes about actual, like, mobile cameras and about movement in and between depth. And it is attention grabbing because it is meant to be. It is, Tanjiro is entering a different space. The fight is happening on almost a different plane. And so those separations really matter. And what they do is they bring the cinematic into the space of anime, where it still looks like anime. It still has the same character designs. It doesn't suddenly, it's not, they've put like the animation over the CGI, so you can tell that this is still animation. So it's not that kind of jarring, but what is jarring about it is these different codes being employed and combined in really dynamic ways. And that, to me, presents so many fascinating, wonderful possibilities for the future of anime, because this is a show that really understands the past, present, and future and different ways of filmmaking. And I know this is a long spiel for me. I just think it's really useful for thinking about this show in particular.
Yeah, and it's this way by which they can take advantage of, like, the things that these different forms of filmmaking are good at and fuse them together and get these, like, sequences that are, like, truly jaw-dropping. I mean, they're, like, at their core, they're jaw-dropping because they're, like, incredibly well-directed, like, they're well-conceived. And those big 3D camera sequences are universally things that are, like, added by ufotable. They're not, like, a replication of something that is happening in the manga. Most sequences that use them are ones that don't really have an equivalent anywhere in the manga, other than, like, these two characters are fighting, but there's no panel that is showing, like, the same sequence of movements being taken by the character, simply because if you were trying to follow that, it wouldn't make sense to try to use a 3D camera to do it, because the manga obviously is about as far away from being able to use a 3D camera as you could get. Well,
and this is why the whole animatic style has such deep roots, is it comes from manga. And manga is a flat, inherently 2D, side view kind of thing that is not about movement into depth, and it's about literal, like, image collaging and compositing in your eyes as you go across the different panels. And so, yeah, it's an inherent rethinking of space. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm going to post to Jonathan in our chat. And this is something I'm going to, when this podcast goes up, I'll make a Twitter thread as well that just has some of these links to a bunch of my favorite shots from the show. So, like, one I want to just kind of, like, talk about very directly is there's a 16-second shot in the Manor sequence where it's after the demon hits his, like, drums, like, 3 or 4 times in a row. And so the room spins around in multiple different ways. And it's almost one, like, entire long shot. It's about an 11 long, like, sustained sequence of Tanjiro tumbling around in the room as the room shifts with him. And then the camera moves in behind him, follows him down towards the demon, where then the demon slices at him, and that's the first cut. and then Tanjiro like dodges and then recovers. And that is a sequence that, again, like there's not quite an equivalent to this in the manga that's trying to represent. This is like they're adding in different dynamics into the fight sequence. But I think one of the things that's really remarkable is that you can imagine ways that a 3D movie camera would be able to get some of these kinds of shots, although you'd have to do so much of it with CGI. But like, there's something about when you have 2D animated elements and 2D animated characters that lends such a stark clarity to movement and to what is in the frame, because you design so specifically every single element that exists in the frame when you're drawing it 2D, right? You're not relying on a 3D model that exists like independent of the scene. You're not relying on an actor that exists independent of the scene. Everything that's in the scene was made for the scene, specifically for the scene, by people drawing it by hand. And so that combination of complex 3D movement you might see in a CG movie or in a like action film, combined with the incredible stark clarity of character and movement that 2D animation and 2D animation techniques can blend or can bring to it, just creates such, I think, a like dynamic and exciting element to the visual part of the show. That like, and this is something that is, again, this is very ufotable. So if you watch any of their Fate adaptations, if you watch Kata no Kyokai, which is where this style like really starts from with them, like they are so good at this and have been for like years, like over 10 years at this point, really pioneering this style. And again, you're starting to see other studios starting to kind of catch up to a little bit of this, but there is still these sequences in Kimetsu that like I just find utterly jaw-dropping, that combine all those pieces together to give you something that you just would never see in anything else.
Well, and this is why I love, what you were explaining about their studio culture, and that they have the digital artists, the CGI artists, and the hand, 2D artists working together. They're not like in a separate building, never going to meet. They're not, outsourcing it all. And it's why I also wanted to bring in these two tendencies, the animatic and the cinematic, because it feels like they have a deep understanding of both of those and an idea of how they can work together, because that's what you're seeing in a scene like this, right? Of where you are bringing a cinematic camera into the codes of like an animatic visual style, and you're sort of rupturing it. And those ruptures become really powerful moments. It's, again, they know that you are going to be jarred a little when it happens, right? Because this looks different than the rest of the show, but it's jarred for the right reason. Like, what is happening to Tanjiro there? Something fucking crazy that he's never seen before. So it should be jarring, and it's jarring in the best, most imaginative way. Unlike a lot of good CGI movies now, it's doing stuff with the camera, as you noted, Sean, that would be really hard to do with an actual film camera, but that a film camera can theoretically do because it is unbound and it can move, right? It's human hands that are a little limited. So that's why the CGI becomes so important. And yes, I agree with everything you said. Like, the specific blend they are going for is just so far and beyond what anyone else, I feel like, has quite imagined what you can do with these tools in tandem with each other. And that's something that makes this so special. It makes me want to see some of Ufotable's other stuff too, because it is such a cool idea, and it offers such a rich like vein of analysis for what the future of anime could look like. Not saying like everything should look like this, but this is a great example of one studio planting a flag and saying, well, here's one way we can integrate these tools and evolve and synthesize things, And I'm excited to see, and certainly some other people have done great versions of this. I'm really fascinated, like I said, with that new Lupin the Third movie, which does an amazing job with just taking a very straight anime style and then doing it in CG in a cinematic 3D view. And this is another version of that in a very different way, and it's wonderful and fascinating.
Absolutely. So is now the time where we have to talk about episode 19, Jonathan?
Yes, but just a second.
Okay.
I do just want to say, episode 19 is my favorite episode. It's the best fight. I think the other best fight in the show, to me, is the one with the drum and the one we were just talking about. I think that's like my number 2, and then probably below that is various ones from the Spider Forest, because there's a bunch of great ones in there. I particularly love the one that Tanjiro and Inosuke team up for, and Inosuke at the end realizes, oh my god, Tanjiro he sees everything. He sees the flow. He's not looking for the strike. He's looking at the flow. Those are all things I love. But all of it pales in comparison, as most things do, to what they pull off in episode 19, Hinokami. Holy fuck.
Yeah, so I remember very distinctly when episode 19 dropped, because I don't watch these kinds of shows as they air, because I like to usually watch a few episodes at a time. But I keep kind of like feelers out in some communities online just to be like, okay, when there's our shows airing, what's like the stuff that people are picking out that seems really good, and I kind of like put that in like my list of, okay, when the season is over, I want to watch this show, and that show. And so Kimetsu no Yaiba was one that had been on my radar for a while because people were really liking it. But after episode 19 dropped, people lost their fucking shit. And I just saw it. I'm like, what the fuck happens in episode 19 of this goddamn show? And I just remember so distinctly, the words Kimetsu no Yaiba in episode 19 were like burnt into my head. Because I was like, man, like the reaction online was so explosive. This incredibly positive way. And I was like, man, okay, like I knew that people were kind of into this show, but I didn't know they were this in. And I think that's when I looked into it and saw that it was being made by ufotable, which again, I wouldn't have pegged because ufotable has never done in their like modern era of the studio and a manga adaptation. They've always done either something like based on a game or based on a visual novel, or I guess a series of light novels in the case of Kata no Kyokai. So I was like, oh, okay, ufotable did this. Probably some crazy fucking shit happens in episode 19, huh? So yeah, then when I was watching the show, I had that like in my head for most of it of like, I don't know what's gonna happen, but something fucking crazy is gonna happen in episode 19. And then episode 19 happens, and it is like one of the best episodes of anime I have ever seen in my life. Like, it is so unbelievably good. And it's something where, especially reading the manga, it highlighted for me, like, this is where I think some of like the smartest like nips and tucks they do as an adaptation to sort of put this into an episode format are. So like one thing they do to set this up as like its own episode, because I rewatched this episode last night because I was like, I need to watch episode 19 again right before we do the podcast because it's fucking episode 19 of Kimetsu no Yaiba. Is the episode opens with a little brief scene of Inosuke that picks up from where the previous episode left off. Then you get Gurenge by Lisa, like all-time great anime opening song, and then you get you pick up with Zenitsu, and Zenitsu on top of the manor. They're like the house thing that is like suspended by spider webs, and Shinobu's there, and he's breathing, trying to keep himself alive, and he says like Ji-chan, like Gramps, and Shinobu says, who are you calling Grandpa? He says, I could hear him. He told me not to give up. And then there's Shinobu sort of, as she's administering medicine to Zenitsu, she describes like, oh, the reason why people have these, like, your life flashes before your eyes thing happens is because your body is trying to relive all of your memories and experiences to try to find a way to survive whatever this is. That scene is not in the manga. The narrative, what Shinobu says is basically pulled from a narrative caption at the end, because the manga has like lightly uses a narrator. It's not like a frequent device, but occasionally a like disembodied narrator will comment on something and give like context, and that's something that over the frame of because he uses this exact shot in the anime of like Tanjiro's life like shattered in glass in front of him. There are narrative blocked boxes in that panel of the manga that go through that exact same thought process, sort of explaining what's happening. I think it's like such a smart adaptational choice to say, let's put a little extra scene with Zenitsu here, take some of that content, give it to Shinobu to characterize it in the fiction, and sort of construct a circular narrative device by which at the beginning of the episode you are given this concept of your life flashing before your eyes, and then like basically at the beginning of the climactic moment of the episode, you are then seeing that happen to a different character to create a sense of flow within the story. And there are lots of little things like that they do in terms of changing some of the pacing of the fight with Dewey. They add in the moment where Dewey says to Tanjiro, like, oh, you think that if all you could do is if you could just have that sword connect with my neck, you'd be able to win? Like, go for it. And then Tanjiro swings and hits Dewey's neck and he can't cut through it. That is not from the manga. They put that scene into the anime to set up specifically the stakes for the expanded climax of the episode they put in, where you have the big sequence where he has his flashback to his father. He uses the Hinokami Kagura Inbu style, cuts through the threads, and then has this big, long, crazy tracking shot that I'll share, that I have the gif of, that is just like a masterpiece, like unbelievable jaw-dropping piece of animation. That obviously that whole bit is not really in the manga. It's just he kind of cuts through, and it's kind of like 2 or 3 like attack dodge things that happen that lead up to that last cut on the neck. But if they're going to really expand that sequence out, they need to create the specific tension of, can Tanjiro even cut the demon's neck? You don't necessarily know. There's lots of little pieces like that in episode 19 where it feels like they took a lot of care, that they looked at what is like one of the most remarkable narrative sequences in the stretch of the manga we're adapting. What is kind of going to be really the action climax of this season? It's going to be this sequence. So let's really put a lot of energy into making that sequence feel climactic and not just, here's the end of another one of these story arcs, where in the manga it's a really great sequence still, but it doesn't feel like Gotouge sensei is like throwing 110% into that scene, because they don't need to. It's not that important in like the overall scheme of the entire manga. It's just another sequence. In the anime, it's the last big action scene you have. It's the big action climax of your whole season. So they really put so much love and care into making sure that it was as perfect an episode as possible. And that's just in terms of like that action and like plot setup. But then really it's all to serve the purpose of the main narrative conflict, which is between Dewey, who is your foil for Tanjiro, who is using violence to try to construct forcibly a family for himself, versus Tanjiro, who violence has taken his family from him, and he is desperately trying to protect the one piece of family he has left. Like, that core narrative element is so powerful, and they just took everything they had to build an entire episode to execute on that as perfectly as possible, and that is how you get Hinokami, episode 19, which is just, I think, like a masterpiece episode of animation.
I 100% agree. Absolutely. And I want to double back on all the things I love about this scene, and we'll talk about it more in a second. But with you talking about like the adaptation choices, I do just want to raise like one kind of nagging issue for me with all of this. Because I also was like super curious when I watched this, like, what the hell is this in the manga? And the thing is, so this scene is amazing. It's more than amazing. It is one of the best scenes of TV anime ever. It's unbelievable. And when it happened, I watched, I was like, oh my God, I turned it off. I went and like walked around a little bit, and then I took a shower just to like think about it. And I went to bed and I watched the next one the next morning. And I really felt quite a big sense of deflation from the demon not actually being dead. Like that felt cheap to me in a way that like was discordant. And then I went and looked at it in the manga, and it's less discordant in the manga because that is a less big moment in the manga. And like, you just go from one page to the next. And I know in like serialization, you would have had to wait a week, but like, especially for reading it in the volume, it doesn't have the music. It's not like visually a giant leap from the stuff around it. They haven't added those thematic threads that you're pointing out. They haven't made this in Gotouge's manga. It is not the key thematic closer to an entire like season of anime. And so the demon, he didn't actually kill it. Okay. Do you think they made the moment too big, given that the demon isn't actually dead and Tanjiro didn't kill it and didn't actually cut through its neck?
So I think I kind of felt that way a little bit the first time I watched it. On rewatching, no. I think mostly because to me it is such a like triumph of theme, right, for Tanjiro, that like even if he doesn't literally kill the demon, I mean, one, like him doing this is what saves their lives, right? Like him being able to fight back despite all odds. Like whether or not he is literally able to kill Nui here or not, he is able to buy enough time for Gyu to show up, and then when Gyu shows up, Gyu just like takes care of him, right? Like it's kind of nothing, with like the vague implication that like part of it is because the demon has like it's expended itself enough on this fight with Tanjiro, it can't even do anything to Gyu. He just like uses Nagi and kills him in one hit. I think on first watch you're so like thrust through the sequence with the animation and the music and everything. I think it does feel a little bit disappointing. But then on second viewing, I think it worked for me really well how expressive it is, because it so feels expressive of what Tanjiro is feeling inside explodes out like symbolically in the visuals of the show. Because one thing I think is like important to like keep in mind that I think is really fascinating about Kimetsu Yaiba is that they have this visual of like the water and the fire and the lightning, But that doesn't literally exist outside of, and we'll talk about it in a second, like the fire of the last strike that Tanjiro does is literally fire because that's like Nezuko's blood that's exploding. But other than that, when he goes from water breathing style to Hinokami Kagura, that's not him all of a sudden, instead of water emanating from his sword, fire emanates from his sword. There is like, people aren't getting wet when he's using the water breathing techniques.
Right.
It's a visual expression of like the style of combat he's using. And so I think there's something about that, of like the expressiveness of it, and that it's like, in some ways, like almost not literal, how you're supposed to interpret some of what's happening there. It's more emotional. I think the way that it delivers this thematic triumph for Tanjiro, where this demon represents this idea that you can get what you want from other people and those relationships just by using fear and violence to kowtow them into obeying you. And Tanjiro's declaration of, I mean, two things. He has two really great lines. Earlier in the episode, he has a line where he says, like, and I love the way it's phrased in Japanese, where he says, "Fuzakeru no wa taigai ni shiro," which is like, basically, cut out the fucking bullshit. Like, I've had enough of your horse shit. Like, you will never be able to get what you want by doing the things that you're doing. And it's like, and it's part of, I think, it like reflects that he, in some ways, is still thinking about the demon and what the demon wants and needs, and saying, it's like, what you're doing is never going to get you what you want. And then at the end of the episode, he has his big declaration, which is your big shonen protagonist scream of, the bonds between myself and Nezuko will never be cut. And then he defeats Dewey. Like, that sort of thematic climax, I think, works for me so well, that the kind of minor disinflation of that Dewey is actually alive didn't really affect me much on the second viewing.
So I agree with all of that, and the more I've thought about it, and I'm taking a little bit of a devil's advocate position because I just think it's worth talking about, because the more I think about it, the more I generally agree. I guess it's just there is just this discordance to me of all of that is true, but if Giyu didn't magically show up at that second, they'd be dead anyway. Like, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, I guess, and especially, like, if they were already making adaptational changes, I wonder if for the anime it would have been better for, like, he's just dead and Giyu comes by and is like, holy shit, this kid's crazy. I don't know. And this is maybe because I haven't read more. And I assume the moment when Tanjiro inevitably does kill one of the 12 demons is a giant, like, status quo shifting moment in the story. And so maybe they just can't move that up.
One thing I'm going to say, Jonathan, is like they really can't, because that is specifically what the man of the manor tells Tanjiro in the meeting with the Hashira is go out and kill a Juni Kizuki, and that will make people listen to you. So that's clearly like a big point for the story, is that he needs to have a fight with a Juni Kizuki where he wins, sort of unassisted. So like I think it would be too much for him to be able to do that now. So they certainly would not have been able to like just have him defeat Dewey, because I do think there's something like, I think it works for me in the sense of like Tanjiro still has a lot of room to grow, right? Like we're not anywhere near the end of this series, so like reinforcing the like these demons, like how powerful they are, right? Like how much on a pedestal the Juni Kizuki are, which is something the show like repeatedly reinforces by them repeatedly thinking they're facing one, and then it's not, like it's too easy, it's too simple. And then also then you get the really powerful contrast of then having Giyu be able to just sort of do it with his special magic 11th technique that he has made up, of the 10 water breathing techniques. Well, here's 11, motherfucker. Now you're dead.
Yes. No, and overall, again, I agree with you. I'm sort of like trying to think of like the, why was there that sort of visceral disappointment for me? But the more I think about it, the more I absolutely agree with you. And I think the smart thing it does is that is what kicks us into this being episode 19 of 26. In some sense, you could see the version of this where that is episode 25, and then 26 is cleanup and it's the mic drop, right? But it's not. And the reason for making this not the end of the season isn't just because they want to hype up the movie. That's part of it, let's be honest. But it's not the only reason, right? And I do think part of it is because the overall arc isn't Tanjiro got all the power and won. It's that he got the power he needs. He has that raw potential, but the world is so much bigger. And so the final 7 episodes are the world is so much bigger, right? And that ultimately what this season is they even call it, they're like the Tanjiro coming of age arc is what they call it at the end. And that makes sense because that is the overall arc, where the climax in a very like classical narrative sense, where the climax is not the end, it's somewhere in the middle, is episode 19. But then the rest of the story is that come down of, oh my god, the demon was still alive. Oh my god, Gyu can kill it in one hit, and he can kill it in one hit with this secret 11th technique. Oh my god, there are all these Hashira. They're so powerful. They want to kill my sister. There's this fucking blind, burned guy who they all bow down to. Oh my god, people do total concentration breathing 24 hours a day while they're sleeping, right? So that's what those final 7 episodes become about, is that sort of like expansion of the world and Tanjiro seeing his place within it and recommitting himself. And ultimately, that's the story of this season. And I think even though it's a very unconventional ending for a season to end with a training arc, it's, even if there was no movie, even if it got fucking canceled, as tragic as that would be, it's the right choice for this season because that's the story they're telling, is about, because Tanjiro's ultimate heroism is not that he cut Rui's neck. It's that he had the like ferocity of character and the bond with Nezuko, and Nezuko had the bond with him to push through that moment. And when he sees pushing through that moment wasn't enough, he keeps pushing, right?
Yes.
If he was Sisyphus, he'd get that boulder up the fucking mountain.
Yeah, no matter no matter how many times he had to push it, yes, it's his like the love he has for his family and the love his family has for him, and his just good old fashioned gumption is what saves the day.
So, in the end, I agree, and I think it's the right choice overall, and obviously it is the story in the manga, so there's kind of no other choice to make. But that's just, I kind of wanted to interrogate that for a moment, because I do think it's an interesting question. Ultimately, I do agree with you on this. But yeah, that whole moment, somehow we've talked about all this with episode 19 and not even talked about the most perfect fucking insert song. Like,
yes.
That is maybe the best use of an insert song in an anime I have seen since Unmei no Hi in Dragon Ball Z, which is when Gohan goes Super Saiyan 2, which is, to me, like the patron saint of perfect insert moment songs. This is up there. This is like Unmei no Hi territory. Holy fuck, it's good.
Yeah, so yes, that whole sequence that starts where the threads are closing in on Tanjiro, he has the flash of the, like, his life flashes before his eyes, and that's where you see that he is the child of Lock-on Stratus from Gundam 00, Shinichiro Miki. And yeah, so you get his little kid Tanjiro, who's very adorable, right? And you get the stuff that, like, you get these little hints that there's something going on with his family and, like, Muzan and stuff, like the earrings. There's something more happening here, that you get, like, little more hints that there's obviously, like, a bigger story going on. But his family, who, like, they say, like, work with fire. And I think one thing that was interesting that I noticed when I read the manga, so I read the manga in Japanese, and Tanjiro's name, the first kanji in his name, that Tan, is the same kanji you'd use for coal, which is what he's selling. Like, in the first episode, he goes down to the village to sell coal, because that's what his family does. So he's like, and the G is like the kanji for heal, and then No at the end is like a standard sort of like male name ender. So it's like he's like the healing coal boy, is more or less what his name means. But you have this...
I'd love it if they had just translated that for the dub.
Yes.
And he goes around and he's just like, healing coal boy, help me!
Yes, exactly. And then Kamado also is like a word that can mean forge. So that's another, like fire is clearly something connected to him. Urokadaki-san, like, comments that he has a reddish color to his hair and eyes, which also is like a, you're a child of the sun or whatever. I forget what the specific wording they use. But, like, you have that, like, imagery around the sun and fire and warmth connected to Tanjiro throughout the whole show. And here you get it kind of climaxing where you find out that his father does this dance, this worship dance for the Hinokami, which means the god of fire, Hinokami Kagura. And you have their, like, just the most ufotable thing ever, where they fucking rotoscoped. And it's like, you don't see rotoscoping in anything ever. And they're like, we're going to rotoscope this fucking dance to make it, like, really smooth and very striking of his dad dancing amongst these torches. And then that sort of sparks this memory of he was taught as a kid the breathing of this dance and to do this dance, and then that's what sort of activates the Hinokami Kagura Inbu style that he uses to cut through the threads. but obviously it's like symbolic. So it's like you have all this like imagery of fire, and symbolically it's this like connection he has to his family that gives him the like vision and the clarity and the ability to cut through. It's this thing that like these bonds and relationships he had his whole life is what gives him those tools. And then it's the same thing. Then you get cut to Nezuko, who has a vision of their mother, who tells her like, you have to wake up, Nezuko, or even your brother will die. It's very sad the way it's framed, where it's like clearly like her from, you know, whether it's literally that or Nezuko's vision of her, but this vision of the mother from beyond the grave saying it's like, it's just you two left. Like, you have to wake up, because if you don't, even Tanjiro will die also. Then she wakes up and can use the exploding blood art, which also obviously connected to fire, burning away the threads of Dewey's attack. Then you get, and so that's where all the insert song is playing over all this. The insert song then builds up to the chorus, where you have just the most sick fucking sequence, where this is all added into the anime that was not in the manga, of Tanjiro pushing Dewey back and pushing him back and back and back, with this big spinning 3D camera following them through the forest with the fire lighting up their faces. And that's such a satisfying moment where Tanjiro gets just close enough that Dewey recognizes he's a threat and Dewey has to back away. And that's something that doesn't exist in the manga, that I love that moment so much, where Dewey actually has to move and be on the defensive. And to me, in many ways, that's where Tanjiro kind of like really wins, is this recognition that he is a threat, right? That he can like touch you. He can be on that level. And then you have the big sword hitting the neck. It explodes. And
they do it like fucking like Jackie Chan's last stunt in Police Story, where they do it and then they do it again and then they do it again from different angles, and it's so good.
Yeah, and one thing that's an interesting detail that is pointed out by the narration in the manga, and I had not noticed in the anime, but they do show it visually, is that one of the things that allows Tanjiro to cut through, I mean, he doesn't literally cut through his neck, right? There's like that whole thing, but the thing that like gives him that last push is that Nezuko's blood dripped onto the sword earlier in the fight sequence, and her blood explodes, propelling his sword even further. So that's one of the reasons why I think they draw the fire in that last slash so differently in the anime, is to sort of give that sense of, that's like actual fire. That's in like a literal explosion is happening with his sword, fusing Tanjiro and Nezuko's powers together, because it is, of course, their bond that allows them to triumph.
It's because I read that manga chapter, and there's several things. There's a bunch more like narration and dialogue that ufotable smartly took out, because this is more of a visual and audio and like music sequence. But there's that. They also explicitly point out that Tanjiro will die, because he's planning on doing this cut where his arm is going to get cut by all those threads, and he's going to be fucking cut to ribbons, but he'll at least kill the demon and save Nezuko. And the show, like, you can tell that's what's going to happen, and Nezuko obviously has to save him. But they add these things that, like, the show is confident enough that you will get all of that. You don't need it explained, and it's excellent.
Yes. And so all this stuff is, like, you know, when we talked about, or like the heart of the shonen like genre so much is this feeling of like, it's about family and friends and like bonds with the people around you that will allow you to triumph. And that's like your like standard sort of set of themes that these shows are like basically always going to do. But I feel like most series just sort of like those themes are there, and then sometimes they'll be prominent, sometimes they kind of go into the background. But I feel like they're not always really good at like actually thematizing it or like dramatizing it with the staging of the show. And here, this is, I think, is by far the most effective I've ever seen those themes communicated to the audience on an emotional level, using the staging and dramatization of what's happening in the plot. Like the imagery of fire and warmth in the sun connected to Tanjiro in his family, I love, because it is right, like that's what the demon destroying blade is it's not the Nichirinto, it's Tanjiro, right? It's like his warmth as a person is what can like cut out the demon. I
mean, we're forgetting to say he doesn't even have a full blade. He's doing it with a fucking broken sword hilt. Like it's really literalizing what you're saying, because he does not have enough to cut anything on its own. It's him.
Yes, and it's like that warmth and power that he gets from the relationships he has. And I think this is where they leverage that familial connection so powerfully, where like I find that smash to credits so emotional, where when it smashes to credits after he cuts off Ryui's head, the credits are a different credit sequence. You don't have the Fiction Junction song. It is it's continuing the song of Kamado Tanjiro, which is the insert song, and it plays over these beautiful hand-drawn images of Tanjiro and Nezuko and their family all together, like climaxing in this big family portrait of all of them together, and then an image of modern-day Tanjiro and Nezuko kind of embracing alone in the middle of a white frame. And that sort of visualization of it is these relationships, even the ones that have been cut from his life by these demons, that have given him the power to get to where he is, and allowed him to be this person that is like the embodiment of the sunlight that kills the demons in like human form, basically. I just find it such a beautiful, elegant sequence and a beautiful, elegant episode that so perfectly delivers on these themes that are a part of the series as a whole. Like, they're certainly in the manga, but I think like this sequence just gets it down to such a fine point and expresses it so perfectly.
100% agree. If you had like been filming me watching this, it could have become a viral reaction video. I was like screaming at the TV, like, oh fuck, like just like oh my god. I was like leaning forward in my seat. I was like half standing by the end of it, just so jazzed by this thing. And then yeah, the credits are perfect. Do you think ufotable knew that they were going to break the entire anime industry and manga industry with this episode? Like, how key do you think episode 19 is to basically what Demon Slayer has become in terms of its overall popularity?
Like, I do think it's important. Like, I think it's like, I do think this specific moment and that ending sequence, like, it is. There's no way to watch that episode and not come away from it in love, right? Like, you have to love that episode. Like, it's just impossible not to. It's so powerful on this, like, raw emotional level. And again, it's like tapping into things that are just there throughout the whole show. It's just sort of exposing it so like perfectly and like in this very raw fashion in this one sequence. That like I would be willing to bet quite a lot of money that if you looked up the timing of manga sales for Kimetsu no Yaiba, I'm sure that there was a pretty big fucking jump after this episode came out of people being like, I need to fucking get this whole thing in my body right now because my god.
Yes, or even just if you were streaming it and you were binging it, like episode 19 is probably the point where you whip out your phone and start buying all the individual volumes, which leads to Oricon having like 20 of the top 20 are all Kimetsu no Yaiba. Because like I'll just say, like I have all of it through the Shonen Jump app, which I subscribe to. It's $2 a month, and I still don't know how they can charge that much for it because it's great. And so I've been looking at it there. But if I didn't, like, I would have probably like gone on Amazon and just like ordered a whole like fucking box of these books after that sequence, because I would have been like, I need to inject more of this as just a raw drug into my veins. This is so good.
Yeah, it is. So it is like one of the most standout sequences ufotable has done, or ufotable. Like, I think the only thing that competes is some of the stuff in the Heaven's Feel movies, I think, is like kind of on this level in a different way. It's less of a like entirely feel good kind of thing that movie's going for, because it's a lot darker, but like the same elegance of using animation to express these ideas in this really raw emotional way.
So good.
And man, especially after watching those 3 Heaven's Feel movies, which are the first movies that the studio has made since the Kata no Kyokai stuff, which those are also a little bit lower budget because they made a lot of them in a pretty short span of time. They made 3 movies over the course of basically 4 years, and those movies look really fucking nice. And it's like, think about what this fucking Kimetsu no Yaiba movie is going to look like, Jonathan. Like, think about this is the TV show. This is a fucking TV show. Like, this show is like the main thing I was thinking about when we talked about 00 Gundam on Weekly Suit Gundam, and I said that like there's only a couple of small things about the show that shows like visual style that felt slightly out of date to me, and the main thing I was thinking of is like how rich the content of the frame is in any given moment in Kimetsu no Yaiba, with like 3D elements and post-processing effects and like dust and like motes of dust floating and beams of light in the air. Like all those little elements that add so much richness to the visuals of the show is just mind-blowing to me. And this is the TV show. It's like, how do you top this in a fucking movie when this is what you did in the TV show? I'm very excited to see and find out.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I'm so excited to see it, as God intended in a fucking movie theater, too. It's like, this was 4. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I think we're running up maybe on as much time as we can possibly spend on Kimetsu, but do you want to say anything about the closing training arc, which is primarily comedic in tone, but I think it's great comedy. It's well earned after the general darkness of the entire Spider arc, which is pretty long. It's like 8 episodes. Yeah. And obviously just moves into some really good territory for the characters. And I think that finale is a fantastic episode.
Yeah, because I think you kind of expressed a lot of how I feel about it. I think it's just such a good kind of denouement to the season that you come down from this big emotional high. I think the whole scene with the Hashira and then the Man of the Manor showing up and them debating about whether they should kill Nezuko, I think that is like such a dynamite sequence. It's so rich with characterization and drama.
Yes. I was squirming in my seat when he's fucking torturing Nezuko. That is hard to watch.
Yeah. And that's like one there, I feel like you read that also in the manga, and it's like, man, this is like one of those, it's just such a dynamite scene. It's so well constructed and staged and sort of spaced out it's like, it's one of the best sequences in the manga as well. But yeah, I really love the characterization of like Kano and Shinobu you get there. They do add, what I'm going to guess this must be later in the manga, because it seems like it'd be weird for the show to make up when they haven't made up extended sequences. But that big flashback of Kano's backstory of her being like this sort of like vagrant child who's like a slave that is bought, that's not in that part of the manga. And I'm guessing that backstory is given later. But you have all this.
That'd be really weird if it wasn't.
Yes, yeah. But you have all the stuff with like the flipping the coin and all that. It's just, like really great characterization and just really good humor and expanding the sense of the world and what is going on in Kimetsu with seeing the Hashira and like the upper echelons of what this sort of like dynamic is with the demons and the Demon Slayer Corps.
Yes. And my other favorite scene in the whole show, behind the scene in episode 19, is the big Muzan Kibutsushi scene in
Oh, yes. Oh, my God, yeah.
Holy goddamn fuck. And also, if you want to talk about ufotable doing crazy shit with CGI and 3D space and all of that, his weird realm where it's like fucking MC Escherville, but if MC Escher was a fucked up demon, it goes full Junji Ito, I feel like, at points, with just how bloody and fucked up it is. I mean, my God, Sean, that scene is unreal.
Yes, no, that is like, that is maybe in many ways the most impressive blend of the 2D and 3D stuff, because they lean into the uncanny elements of the 3D camera more. Because the manga obviously gives them opportunity, because the manga has the whole MC Escher thing. But here you kind of get to explore it with this very kind of disorientating 3D camera. And yes, then I posted for you, Jonathan, in the chat. And again, I'll put a bunch of these GIFs when this episode comes up so you can see them on Twitter. But the sequence of the demon trying to escape, and he jumps through the whole thing after you've been introduced, kind of coming through that sequence. You go back out through this labyrinthine sort of Japanese castle interior, and then the guy just gets like sort of grabbed and his head fucking cut off. Yes, it's just such potent horror. It's so unsettling and uncanny. And I love the demon who survives, who he's just like, thank you for saving me for last, because I so enjoy like screams of pain and terror that I'm just was so delectable seeing all these other demons just get brutally murdered by you. And then Kibutsuji Muzan's like, you're like the only one of these who's actually like fucking evil, so I'm going to give you a bunch of blood and have you go get this weird earring boy for me.
It's amazing. And that whole final episode 26, it's utterly unconventional as a season ender, because it is complete. It like, again, like you in a like utilitarian sense, it's just setting up the movie. But it feels like such the right ending for this season, because it is so much about that crossroads that Tanjiro is at, of we get our first full glimpse of the villain, and he is truly terrifying. But we also see Tanjiro at like his absolute best in that moment where he flips the coin and like kind of frees this girl and gives her the coin. It's beautiful. And then all of his strength with his friends and everything. And you see both the immense weight of the evil he is up against, and the innate goodness and determination within himself, because he's also mastered the total concentration breathing and all of that, that these are the things that are going to go up against each other. These are the stakes. They are laying down here without drawing the explicit connection, but the connection is putting them in the episode together. These are the two forces that are going to hit, and who are you sort of betting on? And with everything you've seen so far, Tanjiro isn't there yet. He couldn't go fight Muzan right now, but you've seen the process that's going to allow him to get there, and that's why this is the right ending for the season.
Yeah.
And it's just really smart, because it could really easily feel like a crass, and now go buy tickets for the movie. But it doesn't. It makes me want to see the movie very badly. But it, again, if, like, I don't know, if everyone at ufotable got raptured and it was just gone, and there were no anime, I'd be very sad. It would still be a very satisfying season closer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That I think it is just sort of thematically wraps things up. And yeah, like, because it's very common that you'd have, I mean, you wouldn't have an ending exactly like this, because like the training arc thing is like that big extended thing. But like, it would not be uncommon in another anime that would never have gotten another season of material like this to like have the penultimate episode be the big fight, then the last episode is like they're kind of recovering and joking around a little bit more, and then like the last minute or two is a teaser of things that, like, if you've read the manga, you're like, oh my god, that character is going to be in the big next arc, and then it never gets, nothing more gets adapted. Like, that's super common. Obviously they already knew they were making the movie when they got to this point with the anime, but it still would, like, as you're saying, if that was just something that unfortunately happened with the show and you just never got more, it feels like it is a strong ending point to the story that's being told within the confines of this season. You also get, you end on, I think, one of the strongest jokes, which is Inosuke not knowing what trains are, and then Tanjiro goes up and he's like, no, Inosuke, that's not like a big dragon monster. This might be just the benevolent guardian of this land. And it's like the fact that Tanjiro doesn't know shit either is so funny. It's really good.
Then Inosuke getting to look at him and be like, oh, you're a fucking country bumpkin. It's great.
It's a very good joke. And then you do get, your big teaser shot for the movie, which kicks so much ass, of the big CG train and the camera racing along it, and then it passes Rengoku, who's sitting like a seat, and the camera like goes into slow-mo, and you see him as it, like, the camera goes around him, then it swoops up on top of the train and goes up to the demon that you saw and just get all of Muzan's blood, and it's like, and now go watch the movie, and you're like, fucking A, I want to go watch that movie. Well, you mean it's not going to be out over here in the States for 2 years? Well, shit.
Yes. I will buy a ticket to Japan. Uh-oh, coronavirus, I can't. So good. So good. And, there's a lot we have not had full time to talk about yet. The musical score for this show is great. Every element of this is fantastic. I adore this show, Sean. I am so happy to have this and be able to, follow it now through the rest of its life, however long it takes to finish the adaptation. I think right now my plan is that I am going to watch the movie without reading that part in the manga, and then I probably will have to just devour the manga and spoil myself, because I don't think I will be able to resist. Yeah,
I think that's, like, it's going to be hard for the next week to not just continue reading the manga, but I want to try to just watch the movie fresh. And then after that point, there's absolutely nothing that is going to stop me from just reading the rest of the manga, because the manga is so good, and the anime is such a smart adaptation with, like, the little things they, like, change is almost too strong a word, like the adjustments they make in the adaptation, that I think even if you've read the manga, the anime, I suspect, is going to be super fresh, because watching the anime then going to the manga, even like basically like almost at the same time, which is how I did it this time around, like it still felt really fresh reading the manga, because there's two really great stories being expressed really effectively in two different mediums.
It's awesome. I can't wait to experience more of this. Movie next week. Thank fucking God.
It's just so good.
Japanimation Station.